The night always began with a scent sharp, chemical, almost sweet, drifting through the narrow corridors of a London surgery. Lamps hissed, velvet curtains trembled, and somewhere behind a half-closed door, a patient breathed in chloroform as if it were a lullaby. Doctors spoke in calm, confident tones, but their hands moved quickly, almost nervously, as though they knew they were walking a line between healing and harm. In this age of elegance and shadows, cocaine was stirred into invigorating tonics, morphine dripped into teacups, and ether whispered its way into drawing rooms where respectable families swore it was just another modern miracle. The city glowed with progress and trembled beneath the weight of its own addictions. But tonight, the fog outside pressed against the windows with unusual insistence, and a single misstep, a droplet of ether spilled, a hand trembling too much could turn the elegant calm into a catastrophe. A patient could stop breathing mid-lullaby. A nurse could slip and shatter glass that held a fatal dose. Danger hung in the air, invisible but palpable, wrapping itself around every lamp, every table, every trembling hand. In a city enthralled by its own chemical comforts, a single mistake could echo through the halls, the rooms, and the very lives of those who trusted their safety to these medicines. A world built on ambition, anesthetics, and quiet desperation, this is where our story begins. Subscribe and stay with me. More fog-lit truths wait in the corners, where medicine blurred into danger and the night never truly slept. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? The gas lamp flickered long before dawn, its flame thin and unsettled, as though it sensed something in the room that did not belong. The glass chimney rattled softly against its metal frame, sending a wavering circle of light across the surgeon's cramped chamber. The walls, stained by years of smoke and disinfectant vapors, seemed to breathe with the shifting glow. And beneath it all hung that unmistakable scent, sharp, metallic, strangely sweet, the first whisper of ether rising from the bottle left uncorked on the wooden desk. It filled the air in gentle waves, clinging to the curtains, the doctor's coat, and the cracked leather chair that had seen more suffering than comfort. Dr. Jonathan Hale stood with his back to the lamp, his shadow stretching long and narrow across the tiled floor. He had not slept properly in weeks. The city outside had been restless, sickly, vibrating with the strange new confidence that modern medicine promised. In this age, pain no longer had to be endured. It could be quieted, silenced, smothered under the heavy hands of chemicals and vapors. Yet Hale knew better than most that silence came with a cost, one paid not in coin, but in memory, conscience, and the faint tremor in the hands of every man who administered it. The morning's first patient lay on the narrow table in the center of the room. A factory worker, no more than 30, with a gash across his thigh from a collapsed boiler. It is only routine, Dr. Hale had told himself, but nothing in this room ever felt routine anymore. The man's breath was shallow, his face pale as candle wax, and he looked at the ceiling as if trying to memorize one last safe place before the chemicals claimed his senses. Hale reached for the cloth. It was soft, frayed at the edges, and he had used it too many times, though none of his colleagues kept count, and neither did he. The bottle beside it shimmered faintly in the lamplight, its contents clear and innocent-looking. Ether had that quality, deceptive purity. A single drop could numb the senses. A soaked cloth could send a man into a dream. Too much could push him so deeply into the darkness that he might never return. He hesitated only for a breath. The patient's hand twitched in fear. Hale pressed the cloth gently to the man's face. The scent bloomed, sweet and unforgiving, wrapping itself around both of them. The worker inhaled, jerked once, then drifted, his eyelids fluttering like moth wings. The lamp trembled again. Outside, carriage wheels clattered over wet cobblestone. But in the surgery, time held its breath. There was a moment, there always was, when Hale wondered whether he had crossed a line invisible yet sacred. In the old days, pain had been a brutal fact of life, a companion to the wounded and the dying. Now it could be banished with a cloth and a bottle bought from any chemist in London. And yet, Hale often felt as though he were tampering with forces not fully understood, bending the fragile boundary between life and oblivion. As he lifted the scalpel, the ether fog thickened around his patient's still body. Hale's hands were steady, but his heart was not. Something in the room felt wrong, as though the chemical scent was not merely drifting but watching, listening, waiting for the moment when medicine slipped into something darker. Outside, the sky brightened, turning the window panes a pale grey. But inside, the lamp continued to burn with that faint, restless flicker, casting its uneasy glow over the quiet figure on the table, the doctor poised above him, and the silent bottle of ether that had already chosen the tone of the day. The incision began, and with it, the story of a city learning to trust the promise of painless healing, even as it unknowingly surrendered itself to the fog. The bell above the chemist's door gave a soft metallic tremor as it opened, the kind of thin, nervous chime that seemed permanently on the verge of breaking. Morning fog clung to the frame as Dr. Hale stepped inside, bringing with him the chill of the street. But the air within was warmer, denser, filled with the mingled scents of dried lavender, damp paper, and something sharper beneath it all, like the quiet hum of danger, wrapped in the guise of progress. Baker Street's most discreet chemist, Mr. Lionel Marwick, stood behind the polished oak counter, already wearing the expression of a man who knew precisely why his visitor had come. Marwick always appeared too tidy for his profession, not a stain on his cuffs, not a speck of powder on his vest, not a stray hair out of place. Even the mortars and pestles gleamed as though polished daily. But Hale had long suspected that the immaculate order was only a veneer, a way of hiding the shadows curling behind those glass-fronted cabinets. "You're early today, Doctor," Marwick said, his smile thin and practiced. "A troubling case?" Hale did not answer at once. His gaze drifted along the rows of bottles lining the shelves, amber, cobalt, milky glass, each meticulously labelled in Marwick's elegant handwriting. Chloral hydrate, laudanum, ether, coca extract, remedies, every one of them. Miracles, some called them. But Hale knew that miracle and menace often arrived in the same bottle. "I need a fresh supply," he said finally. "The ether is running low." Marwick's eyes gleamed with something unspoken curiosity, perhaps, or the satisfaction of a merchant who sensed desperation. He moved with a measured calm, unlocking a lower cabinet with a key he wore close to his chest. The hinges gave a soft sigh as they opened, revealing a cluster of bottles swaddled in cloth like fragile infants. As he lifted one carefully onto the counter, the faintest trace of its aroma slipped through the stopper. That familiar sweetness, innocent to the untrained nose, ominous to Hale's, drifted upward with an unsettling grace. "You must be careful, Doctor," Marwick murmured. "These days some men use too much. They drown the senses entirely. The hospitals have been whispering about it." Hale felt the words settle like dust along his spine. He knew the whispers. He had lived them. More than once he had stood in his surgery, watching a patient drift too far into the ether fog, wondering if he would return. More than once he had caught himself breathing in too deeply as he worked, his vision softening at the edges. "Medicine advances," Hale replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Pain must be subdued." Marwick leaned closer, resting his hands on the counter. "Pain must be respected," he said softly. "Subduing it, that is another matter." The chemist's shop seemed to shrink around them, the walls closing in with the weight of bottled promises. Hale watched as Marwick wrapped the bottle in thick paper, his movements neat and deliberate. Behind them, a young mother stepped through the door with a coughing toddler in her arms. Marwick's expression brightened instantly, shifting into the gentle warmth he saved for customers who asked fewer questions. Hale stepped aside, listening as she requested something soothing, something to help him sleep. Marwick disappeared briefly into a rear cabinet and returned with a small vial. Hale caught the glint of the label. Godfrey's Cordial. A syrup of opium given freely, cheaply, and dangerously to children all over the city. As the woman paid and left, Hale felt the fog outside seep inward, turning the light inside the shop a muted grey. The air felt heavy with unspoken truths. He took his wrapped parcel and nodded once, though his shoulders carried more weight than when he had entered. On the doorstep, he paused. The chemist's window reflected the street, quiet, slick with dew, and within it, the neat rows of bottles glowed like jewels under the gaslight. But Hale no longer saw their beauty. He saw a city mesmerized by ease, numbed by chemicals, lulled into trusting what they did not understand. He saw the fragile border between cure and collapse, and wondered how long men like Marwick could walk it without falling. With the bottle heavy in his coat, he stepped back into the fog, the chemist's door chiming behind him like a warning swallowed by the morning mist. The townhouse on Wycliffe Row looked no different from its neighbours, 3 floors of pale stone, a black iron railing, and lace curtains drawn with modest precision. Yet anyone who passed close enough could sense that something inside did not move with the natural rhythm of a home. The windows were too still, the house too quiet. Even the door knocker seemed reluctant to make a sound, as if aware that silence here was not an absence of life, but the fragile veil that held it together. Inside, Mrs. Eleanor Sharp lay upon a chaise near the hearth, her breathing soft and faint, her pale hands folded neatly over her lap. A shawl lay across her shoulders, but she seemed untouched by cold or warmth. The fire crackled low in the grate, though she barely stirred. A small table beside her held a cluster of dark glass bottles, some empty, others half-filled, all arranged with meticulous order by the maid who feared, above all else, that her mistress might one day awake to find one missing. The largest bottle was the morphine mixture prescribed by Dr. Hale. He had given it reluctantly, though he wore the stoic mask expected of a man in his profession. Eleanor had been suffering relentless neuralgia pain that struck with sudden, electric cruelty. But somewhere in the weeks between her first dose and the present morning, the line between treatment and comfort had dissolved. The medicine no longer chased away the agony, it chased away everything else. Her husband, Henry Sharp, a barrister of good standing, had grown accustomed to the stillness of his wife's days. He came and went quietly, his footsteps always light upon the hallway floor, as though fearing that sound itself might disturb the delicate calm she lived within. He told acquaintances that she was resting, improving, though he rarely convinced himself. And as he stood that morning near the doorway of the sitting room, watching her faint chest rise and fall, a quiet dread tightened around him like a glove. Eleanor, in her drifting haze, felt none of this. The world reached her only as fragment shadows moving across the ceiling, muffled voices, the gentle clink of glass when the maid prepared her dose. Pain had once held dominion over her days, but now the morphine held something deeper. Her attention, her memory, her waking hours. She lived in a soft, trembling world where time did not gather itself into days or nights, but spilled continuously, like warm water slipping through her fingers. She had not always been so fragile. There had been a time when she laughed easily, when she lingered by the window to watch the flower vendors on the corner, when she played the pianoforte with light, agile hands. But pain had taken all of that, then the cure had taken the rest. And here she lay, cocooned in artificial serenity, unaware that she had traded agony for oblivion. Dr. Hale arrived shortly after noon. He removed his hat in the entryway, his expression composed yet strained, as though the air inside the house already suffocated him. Henry met him with a quiet nod, but neither man found words to break the silence that clung to the walls. In the sitting room, Hale knelt beside Eleanor, checking her pulse with gentle fingers. It was steady, slow, too slow. The faint sheen of perspiration at her temples suggested she drifted deeper with each passing day. As he studied her face, he felt the weight of his own decisions pressing inward, like a tightening band around his ribs. "She is resting," Henry whispered, though he sounded unsure. "She is slipping," Hale corrected softly, unable to hide the tremor in his voice. This mixture was meant to ease her pain, not cradle her entire life. Henry turned away, his jaw tightening. "She cannot endure the pain without it, and cannot endure the world with it," Hale murmured. The maid entered then, carrying the familiar bottle on a silver tray. Her hands shook, not from clumsiness but fear. Hale eyed the bottle with a sinking dread. The liquid within glimmered like amber in the shifting light, beautiful, potent, merciless. He took it gently from the tray, weighing it in his hand. "Half the dose today," he instructed. "We must find a path that brings her back." But even as he spoke, Eleanor's breath deepened, her eyelids fluttering as though some dream clutched her too tightly to release her. Hale watched her for a long moment, feeling the fog of the townhouse seep into him, heavy and unyielding. Outside, the afternoon light dimmed behind gathering clouds. Inside, the stillness settled again, wrapping itself around Eleanor Sharp like a second skin. She slept through her pain and through everything else while the world waited, uncertain whether she would ever fully wake again. The advertisement first appeared on a rainy Thursday, tucked between notices of missing dogs and piano tutors in the Illustrated London Post. The headline shimmered with bold confidence. "Dr. Ferro's invigorating tonic restores vigor, sharpens the mind, strengthens the spirit." Beneath the flourish of Victorian typography, a delicate illustration showed a slender bottle wrapped in garlands of laurel leaves, as though victory itself were corked within. Londoners, weary from long hours in counting houses, factories, and dim little offices where sunlight never quite reached, read the words with breathless hope. By the week's end, the tonic was the newest whisper on trams, in drawing rooms, and along the stone aisles of medical halls. Something modern, something continental, something brilliant had arrived. No one questioned how a single sip could promise so much. Inside a narrow shop off Holborn, Dr. Hale held a bottle of the tonic to the lamplight. The liquid inside was clear with a faint iridescent shimmer, almost lovely enough to forget that beauty in medicine often hid teeth. The cork gave off a light pop as he opened it, releasing a scent both sweet and strangely sharp, like citrus mixed with something far more dangerous. Beside him, Marwick the chemist observed with a knowing smile. "Imported from Paris," Marwick said. "The French swear by it. Artists, students, even their nurses drink it for stamina." "Stamina," Hale repeated, though the word felt too neat, too hopeful. He dipped a glass rod into the tonic and watched a thin bead slide down its length, leaving a brief, tingling coldness on his fingertips. Marwick lowered his voice. "It contains an extract very fashionable. Comes from a South American leaf. Coca, they call it." Hale's stomach tightened. "A stimulant." "Indeed," Marwick replied, pleased, "but a refined one, gentle, civilized, the future, some say." Hale doubted that refinement had anything to do with the matter. He had treated stimulants before their initial charm, their glittering promise of clarity and strength, and then the inevitable collapse that followed like a shadow stepping into the body. Still, curiosity tugged at him. Later that afternoon, the first patient to inquire about the tonic was a young clerk named Edwin Royston, his coat frayed at the sleeves, his eyes rimmed with sleepless fatigue. He perched on the edge of Hale's chair like a boy about to confess a sin. "I saw the advertisement," Edwin murmured. "They say it helps one think, to work longer, to stay alert." His voice cracked on the last word, revealing more exhaustion than he wished to show. Hale studied him, the tremor in his hands, the pallor beneath his eyes, the ink stains on his cuffs. He was young enough to dream, old enough to fear those dreams slipping through his fingers. "You need rest," Hale said gently. "I can't," Edwin whispered. "My employer expects figures ready by Monday. If I fall behind again—" His words trailed off into a silence more desperate than speech. Hale hesitated. The tonic glimmered on the desk beside them, innocent and eager. "A small dose," Hale said finally, though unease pressed against his ribs. "Only when necessary." Edwin's gratitude spilled out like relief. He pressed the bottle to his chest with trembling hands, as though it contained salvation. 2 days later, the clerk returned brighter, livelier, eyes wide with unnatural sharpness. "He could work through the night," he said. His thoughts raced with perfect clarity. He called the tonic a miracle. But beneath the enthusiasm, Hale noticed the twitch at the corner of Edwin's mouth, the way he blinked too fast, the faint sheen of sweat across his brow, though the room was cool. "Another bottle, sir?" he asked breathlessly. "I fear I've finished the first." Hale's heart sank. "Already?" Edwin laughed, a high, brittle sound. "It helps so much. I can do the work of 3 men. He did not notice Hale's silence, or did not care. As the rain drummed against the window pane, Hale wrapped a second bottle, though every instinct protested. Outside, London's fog pressed thick against the streets, swallowing sound. Inside, Edwin Royston clutched the tonic like a lifeline woven from glass. In that moment, Hale understood what the city had welcomed into its bloodstream. Not strength, not clarity, but an illusion dressed in medical respectability. A tonic that promised vigor while quietly demanding its own price. And London, hungry for ease in a world of grinding labor, would pay it with open hands. Beneath the drifting haze of a late afternoon fog, Beaumont Street looked like any other respectable London thoroughfare: polished brass signs, curtained windows, and the quiet shuffle of patients moving in and out of small private practices. Yet, those who walked its length often spoke of a peculiar sensation, that the air itself carried secrets. The walls seemed to lean inward, the cobblestones seemed to listen. It was a place where the city's medical men passed one another with polite nods and lowered voices, their conversations stitched together by caution and unease. Dr. Hale knew the whispers well. He had heard them in stairwells, in the dim anterooms of hospitals, in the narrow corridors of surgical societies. That day, as he walked the length of Beaumont Street with his coat buttoned against the damp, he felt them gathering around him, like moths drawn to a single flame. At the far end of the street stood the modest building that housed the weekly meeting of the West London Medical Circle, a group of physicians who preferred discussion over debate, secrecy over spectacle. Inside, the hall smelled of old papers, stale tobacco, and something faintly antiseptic. A fire crackled in the hearth, but it did little to warm the air thickened by tension. As Hale entered, several doctors, men with silver-tipped canes and stern mustaches, looked up from their murmured conference. Among them was Dr. Arthur Pennington, a tall, thin man whose spectacles glinted like 2 coins in the gaslight. He greeted Hale with a polite but weary smile. "Jonathan," Pennington said quietly, "you've heard, I assume?" Hale removed his gloves slowly. "Heard what?" Pennington hesitated. The others drifted closer, forming a loose circle. "There's been another incident," Pennington whispered. "At St. Brackwell's, a patient failed to wake." Hale's breath caught, though he kept his face composed. "Ether and chloroform," Pennington added grimly. "Used together, an ill-advised mixture." A heavy silence settled upon the room. The crackling fire sounded suddenly intrusive. One of the older doctors, Dr. Silas Wexford, spoke next. "These younger surgeons chase glory at the expense of caution. Chloroform works quickly, so they combine it with ether to shorten the struggle. They forget that shadows fall quickened too." Another man muttered, or they know and simply do not care. Hale felt the truth in both statements. The city was impatient. Patients wanted painless miracles. Surgeons wanted reputation, speed, results. But chemicals were not obedient servants. They were mercurial, temperamental, deadly when misused. "Was there an inquiry?" Hale asked. "Quietly dismissed," Pennington replied. "The family prefers discretion, as does the hospital. The surgeon, of course, insists he followed proper measure." "And did he?" Hale asked softly. Pennington's silence was answer enough. The group dispersed into smaller clusters, each man speaking low, as if afraid the walls might repeat their words. Hale found himself standing alone near the window, watching the fog coil through the lamplight outside like pale smoke from an unseen fire. Pennington approached again, his voice dropping. "You've used ether for years, Jonathan. You are careful, methodical, but even you must see what's happening. These substances are gaining favor faster than we can understand them." "I see it," Hale replied, his tone heavy. "I see it every day." Pennington touched his arm. "And do you see the danger in yourself?" Hale blinked, startled. "What do you mean?" "You carry the scent," Pennington whispered. "It clings to your coat, to your hair, as it does to all of us now. We breathe the very vapors we administer. We walk through our own fog." Hale looked down at his coat sleeve. Indeed, even here, away from his surgery, he could smell the faint sweetness of the morning's ether seeping through the fabric. Outside, a carriage rumbled past, sending vibrations through the wooden floorboards. "There will be more deaths," Pennington said, "and more whispers, and then perhaps regulation." Hale exhaled, the air tight in his chest. "But until then, we walk carefully," Pennington said, "and pray to whatever God listens to men who meddle with unconsciousness." A clock chimed the hour. The meeting dissolved into hats and coats and quiet departures. Hale stepped back into the open air, the fog curling around his boots like a living thing. The street was quiet, save for the lamplighter at the corner, his flame lifting into the dusk. As Hale walked away, the whispers of Beaumont Street faded behind him, but not the weight of what he had heard. The city trusted its doctors. The doctors trusted their bottles. And the bottles, Hale feared, trusted no one at all. The rain had not yet stopped when Dr. Hale reached the steps of Greystone Infirmary. Water slid in thin veins down the stone facade, pooling in the cracks like tears shed quietly through the night. Inside, the corridors smelled faintly of damp wool, carbolic acid, and something sweeter, an unwelcome sweetness that Hale now recognized instantly. Ether. It clung to the air as stubbornly as grief. Nurse Winfield met him at the stairwell, her apron stiff and immaculate despite the exhaustion clouding her eyes. She spoke in a whisper, as though afraid the walls might hear her shame. "He hasn't woken, sir," she murmured. "Not fully." Hale quickened his pace. "How long?" "Since yesterday morning." Yesterday. That meant the patient, Mr. Alfred Morrow, had been suspended in that twilight state for over 24 hours, hovering somewhere between sleep and senselessness, a place where no man was meant to linger. Nurse Winfield led him through a narrow ward where lamps flickered behind frosted glass, casting trembling, distorted shadows across the rows of beds. The other patients watched quietly, their gazes slipping over Hale's coat, lingering on the surgical case in his hand, then moving away again. They all knew what it meant for a doctor to arrive so late in the evening. The last bed was drawn behind a curtain, a poor attempt at granting privacy. Hale stepped inside. Alfred Morrow lay as still as a figure carved from wax. His pale hair clung to his damp forehead, and his eyes, half open, seemed to stare through the world rather than at it. His breathing was shallow, inconsistent, as though each inhale were chosen reluctantly. "What was the procedure?" Hale asked quietly. "A simple closure of a wound," Nurse Winfield replied. "He slipped from his ladder the day before. The surgeon, Dr. Beckett decided to use ether. Hale's jaw tightened. How much? Winfield hesitated. Hale saw the answer in the tremble of her hands. Too much, she whispered. Far too much. Hale drew a stool closer to the bedside and gently lifted one of Mr. Morrow's eyelids. The pupil barely reacted. It was as though light had forgotten its duty. He took the man's wrist next. The pulse crawled beneath Hale's fingers like a creature, unsure whether it wished to continue. Mr. Morrow, Hale said softly, leaning close. Can you hear me? There was the faintest twitch in the patient's fingers, a ghost of movement, easily missed. Hale felt it like a jolt. He's caught in it, Hale murmured. The ether still holds him. Nurse Winfield swallowed hard. Will he wake, sir? Hale did not answer at once. His silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable, settling over the bed like another blanket. Finally he spoke, not as he was. Winfield's eyes shone with dread. Hale continued, his voice low and tinged with sorrow. When ether is administered too deeply, the mind retreats. It wanders. Sometimes it finds its way back. Sometimes, his words faltered. Sometimes it remains lost. He had seen it before patients emerging changed, their thoughts disjointed, their memories blurred, their spirits dimmed as though the fog had entered not just their lungs but their very selves. What of Dr. Beckett? Hale asked. Nurse Winfield's mouth tightened. He said the man was overly sensitive, that the ether simply took more strongly with him. Hale exhaled sharply, a quiet, controlled sound of anger. Ether does not take strongly. It is given strongly. Outside the curtained space, footsteps echoed faintly. A porter's cart rattled across the tiled floor. Somewhere, a woman coughed, the sound scraping like a hinge in need of oil. Hale placed a careful hand upon the patient's shoulder. Mr. Morrow, he said again, gently. You must come back now. Follow my voice. You're safe. But the man lay unmoving, lost beneath layers of chemical sleep. As Hale rose, a wave of hopelessness pressed against him, an old, familiar weight. The city was enamored with painless procedures, marveling at the ability to silence agony. But what no one wished to acknowledge was that sometimes, in silencing pain, they silenced something else too, something vital, something irreplaceable. He turned to Nurse Winfield. Stay with him. Speak to him. Even if he cannot answer. Winfield nodded, tears gathering at the edges of her lashes. Hale paused at the curtain, looking back one final time. The dim lamplight bathed Morrow's face in a golden hue, deceptive in its warmth. A man who had climbed ladders for a living now lay trapped in a place without height, without fall, without any measure of waking reality. As Hale stepped into the corridor, the scent of ether followed him like a phantom, winding through his coat, clinging beneath his collar. And he knew, with a heaviness he could not shake, that Alfred Morrow was not the first Londoner to drift into that half-world, and would not be the last. The hour had crept past midnight when the knock came soft, deliberate, barely more than a whisper, against the heavy oak door of 14 Wycliffe Row. The street outside lay drowned in fog, the kind that swallowed lamplight whole and muffled even the clip of a horse's hoof. Most of London slept uneasily at such hours, but not the people who lived behind drawn curtains and dimmed lamps, the quiet dependents of the chemist's trade. Mary Fletcher, the sharp household's maid, startled awake at the sound. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and made her way down the narrow staircase, her candle flame drifting ahead of her like a trembling thought. She hesitated only once before opening the door. A small wooden box sat neatly on the stoop, its lid secured with twine. No messenger waited beside it. No carriage clattered away into the night. The fog had already consumed whatever ghost had left the package behind. Mary exhaled, her breath shivering in the cold, and brought the box inside. It was not the first of its kind, and she knew it would not be the last. These deliveries came like clockwork, quiet, discreet, always at night. They were meant not for her, but for the mistress upstairs, for the pain that visited Eleanor Sharp like an unwelcome guest, too cruel to leave. But lately, they served another master entirely. She placed the box on the kitchen table and untied the twine. Inside sat 2 bottles swathed in cotton, morphine mixture in one, and a smaller vial of something paler, chloroform drops, prescribed for restless nights. Mary swallowed hard. Restless nights had become endless ones. The street door creaked again behind her, and she turned, startled, to see Dr. Hale standing in the threshold of the kitchen. He had let himself in through the side entrance, as he often did when worry kept him from his own bed. "You shouldn't be awake at this hour," Hale murmured. Mary smoothed her apron, trying to appear composed. "The delivery came, sir." Hale moved closer, his coat dripping from the mist. His gaze fell onto the opened box. Candlelight flickered across the bottles, making their contents shimmer with an unnatural glow. "Another so soon," Hale whispered, more to himself than to Mary. He lifted the larger bottle and examined the label, his thumb brushing the printed dosage. "These cannot continue," he said sharply, though his voice held more fear than anger. "Her body is fading, Mary. And every week the doses rise." Mary's voice cracked. "But without it, sir, the pain—" "Yes, I know," Hale said gently. "Pain is merciless, but these medicines—" He trailed off, as though naming them might summon their ghosts. "They are merciless in quieter ways." Upstairs, the floorboards creaked, soft as a sigh. Hale placed the bottle down and rubbed his temples. He looked older than his years beneath the swaying candlelight, shadows carving hollows beneath his eyes. "These midnight deliveries," he continued, "they are how the city hides its worries, how respectable homes keep their secrets." Mary nodded faintly, though she did not fully understand. She knew only that Eleanor Sharp slept too deeply, breathed too softly, and sometimes did not stir for hours. Hale knelt beside the box, searching through the cotton padding. His fingers brushed a slip of folded paper tucked beneath the vials. He unfolded it slowly, revealing a chemist's ledger note, no signature, only a brief message written in crisp, slanted script. "If rest eludes her again, use the smaller bottle. Only a drop." Hale felt a chill coil through him, colder than the damp fog outside. Chloroform was never meant for private drawing rooms, never meant for sleepless women guarded by anxious maids. Yet here it was, delivered like sugar or tea. Hale rose to his feet. "Tonight," he said quietly, "we give her nothing new. Not until I assess her again." Mary hesitated. "She will ask for it." "Then tell her I came. Tell her I insisted. Tell her," his voice faltered, "tell her I won't lose her to these bottles." Mary nodded, tears threatening to brim. Hale gathered the box, bottles and all, and carried it to the small writing desk by the window. Beyond the glass, the fog pressed thick and impenetrable, as though the night itself wished to keep its secrets sealed. In that moment, Hale understood the truth. These midnight deliveries were not merely remedies. They were invitations to dependence, to quiet ruin, to a deepening sleep from which fewer and fewer Londoners seemed eager or able to return. And the city, still wrapped in mist, allowed the boxes to arrive night after night without a word. The shutters of the Sharp residence remained half closed that morning, letting in only the faintest ribbon of winter light. It slipped like a pale ghost across the hallway floorboards, reached the threshold of the sick room, and seemed to hesitate, unwilling to enter. For good reason. The air inside had grown thick, weighted with the smells of stale morphine, lavender sachets, and old coal dust. It was the kind of room that time tiptoed around, fearful of drawing attention to itself. Eleanor Sharp lay in her bed, upright but distant, her gaze fixed somewhere just beyond the wallpaper. The embroidered flowers behind her headboard had begun to fade. yet she did not notice. Her attention was suspended in a quiet, floating world where hours dissolved like sugar in warm water. Around her, bottles crowded every surface, clustered on the nightstand, lined neatly along the mantel, tucked into the pockets of her embroidered armchair. Their glass bodies caught the weak light and reflected it in small, trembling glimmers, like unsteady stars trapped in captivity. Their labels: morphia mixture, soothing syrup, ether, spirits, chloroform liniment, told a story far louder than the room's silence. Mary, the maid, moved with practiced care as she tidied the collection. She dusted each bottle as though handling relics, though her eyes carried the faintest tremor of dread. She had grown used to their presence, but not to the way they multiplied. They seemed to appear as if summoned by the house itself. For every empty one she carried to the kitchen to discard, 2 more arrived by midnight delivery. Dr. Hale stepped into the doorway just as Mary cleared a place on the table for his medical bag. He paused, surveying the room with a heaviness that deepened the lines beside his eyes. "It's grown worse," he murmured. Mary glanced at him, worry twisting her hands. "I tidy them daily, sir, but she keeps them near. All of them." Hale moved toward the bed, the boards creaking beneath his weight. Eleanor's eyes shifted, not fully focusing but responding to the presence she knew by rhythm, if not by sight. "Eleanor," Hale said softly, "how do you feel today?" Her lips parted, though the answer took a moment, as if her thoughts had to travel a great distance to reach her tongue. "Light," she whispered. "Light, and far away." Hale nodded, scooping one of the bottles from the table and examining the residue clinging to its sides. "How much did she have this morning?" he asked quietly. Mary hesitated. "Half the dose, as you instructed, but—" she asked for the smaller bottle in the night. Hale's jaw tightened. He set the bottle down, its glass tapping softly against the wood. He turned back to Eleanor, his tone gentle but resolute. "No more chloroform drops," he said, "not unless absolutely necessary, and not without supervision." Eleanor blinked slowly, her expression drifting like smoke. "They help me sleep," she murmured. "They help you drift too far," Hale replied. Her hand moved weakly toward the nearest bottle, fingertips brushing the cool glass. Hale caught her wrist carefully, tenderly. She did not resist, only sighed, a faint, hollow sound. Hale felt the weight of the room pressing upon him. Every bottle seemed to accuse him. "You prescribed us. You opened the door. You let the fog in." For a moment, he could not find his breath. He walked to the window and drew the curtains a fraction wider. Cold daylight spilled into the room, revealing the pale dust dancing through the air like tired snowflakes. The bottles glimmered under it, rows of silent sentinels, each promising relief, each carrying quiet ruin. "Mary," Hale said at last, "we need to remove these, not all at once but gradually. Replace them with water, if needed. She mustn't see the change too sharply." Mary nodded, though fear flickered in her eyes. "And if she asks?" "Tell her the doctor is adjusting her regimen," he replied. "Tell her it's necessary." From the bed, Eleanor spoke again, her voice softer than the rustle of the curtains. "Will the pain return?" Hale turned. Her eyes were clearer for a moment, frightened, human, fully awake. He approached her, kneeling at her bedside. "Some of it," he admitted, "but not all, and not forever. Pain can be managed. But this," he gestured faintly to the bottles surrounding them, "this life cannot continue." She closed her eyes, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Hale brushed them away with the back of his hand. Outside, a carriage rattled past, the sound distant and muted by the fog. Inside, the bottles gleamed in their dozens, crowding the edges of a life drifting perilously close to the chemical fog. And Hale knew, if he did not act soon, Eleanor Sharp would disappear among them, another silent casualty of London's quiet addiction. The night ward at Greystone Infirmary had always possessed a mournful stillness, but in recent months it had grown heavier, thicker, almost sentient. Lamps burned low behind frosted shades, turning every shadow into a half-formed figure. The ceilings creaked in soft complaints, and in the long aisles between the rows of iron-framed beds, the air carried a sweetness that did not belong in any place meant for healing. Nurse Catherine Winfield walked the length of the ward with careful steps, her starched apron whispering as she moved. She was young, too young, many said, to have seen the things that her pale eyes already held. But the truth was simpler and crueler. She had learned to look away long before she learned to bandage wounds. Tonight, however, her steps faltered. A patient near the centre bed whined in his sleep, thrashing against a fever that would not break. Winfield approached with a basin of cool water, brushing damp curls from the man's brow. His eyelids fluttered as she whispered a soft reassurance. "You're safe. Rest now." But safety was not what lingered in this room. Behind her, Dr. Beckett, the surgeon whose reputation had begun to gather troubling shadows, strode into the ward with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. His boots clicked sharply against the tile. His coat, immaculate. His eyes, unusually bright. He carried the smell with him. Ether. It clung to his sleeves and hair like a second skin. Winfield stiffened. "Another restless case?" Beckett asked, gesturing toward the patient without truly looking at him. Winfield kept her gaze lowered. "Yes, sir." Fever spiking. "I've cooled his forehead." Beckett waved a dismissive hand. "Cool compresses do nothing against delirium. Bring the chloroform mixture." Winfield hesitated. Chloroform? For a fever. It was improper, dangerous. "Sir." His lungs. "Bring it," Beckett ordered. Sharper this time. Her breath caught in her throat. She obeyed. As she crossed to the medicine cabinet, its lock conveniently broken for weeks, now she felt a prickling rise beneath her collar. She opened the creaking door and reached for the small amber vial. Inside, the liquid glowed faintly under the gaslight, deceptive in its calm beauty. She carried it back with hands that trembled. Beckett took it from her, and without pause placed a few drops upon a cloth before pressing it to the fevered man's face. The patient's thrashing slowed. His breath softened. Silence replaced the struggle. Beckett smiled. "There," he said lightly. "Peaceful." Winfield swallowed hard. She felt no peace, only dread. As Beckett moved on to another bed, humming under his breath, Winfield lingered. The man she had cooled minutes before now lay frighteningly still. His chest rose, too shallow to reassure her. She hovered a hand above him, unable to shake the certainty coiling in her stomach. This was not care. This was control. How many times had she looked away? How many times had she followed orders she knew were wrong? She thought of Mr. Morrow in the private ward, his half-open eyes staring into nothing. She thought of the whispering doctors on Beaumont Street. She thought of the bottles that multiplied like shadows across every surface of this infirmary. And suddenly she understood what her silence had cost. When Beckett's footsteps retreated into the dim corridor, Winfield bent close to the patient's face, listening, begging for the faintest sign of returning breath. A shallow exhale brushed against her cheek. Relief warred with guilt, tightening her throat. She had not killed him, but she had not protected him either. A lamp sputtered somewhere near the far wall, its flame shrinking before flaring again. The ward breathed with it, uneven, strained, exhausted. Winfield stood and steadied herself. Tonight would not be another night of quiet compliance. She moved to the cabinet, lifted the bottle of chloroform, and held it up to the lamplight. The liquid quivered, catching the flame's reflection like a trembling star. Her voice, barely audible, filled the empty space around her. No more. She slid the vial into her apron pocket out of Beckett's reach and closed the cabinet door with a soft click that felt like the first decisive sound in months. The ward remained silent, but something had shifted. A nurse had stopped looking away. and the fog that clung to Greystone Infirmary seemed, for the first time, to recoil from the light. The study in Dr. Hale's townhouse was a sanctuary once lined with dark oak shelves, warmed by an ever-faithful hearth, and perfumed with old parchment and pipe tobacco. But in recent months, the room had taken on a new scent, one that seemed to creep into the walls and settle beneath the floorboards. Ether, morphine, chloroform's faint metallic sweetness, the sweet fog of medicine or something pretending to be medicine. Tonight, the lamp burned low, casting a trembling halo of light over Hale's desk. Papers lay scattered, case notes, hospital registers, chemical analyses scribbled in hastily inked margins. In the center of the chaos sat a single bottle, clear glass, a cork stoppered tight. The liquid inside glimmered with the innocent clarity of spring water. Ether rarely looked dangerous, but it always was. Hale stared at the bottle with an expression caught between reverence and dread. He had administered it hundreds of times, watched patients slip under its spell, heard its whispers in the quiet hours after surgery, but he had never allowed it near himself. He knew better. Every physician did. And yet, he leaned back in his chair, gaze drawn to the flicker of the lamp flame. His hands trembled, the same tremor he had noticed during morning rounds. He had blamed fatigue, cold weather, a skipped meal. But deep down, he feared something else. Proximity. He breathed ether daily. It brushed his skin, seeped into his clothes, clung to his hair. It lingered behind his eyes long after he left the surgery. The line between healer and substance had begun to blur. He lifted the bottle, feeling its weight settle into his palm. How many times had he wondered what his patients saw: the gentle drift, the soft unraveling of fear, the quietening of all pain. Morphine shut out agony with velvet hands, but ether opened a door. To where? He did not know. But the lure of understanding, truly understanding, pulled at him. A knock startled him. His housekeeper, Mrs. Dalloway, peeked into the room. "Another late night, doctor?" "Yes," Hale replied quickly, too quickly. "Just notes. You may retire." She hesitated, her gaze flicking to the bottle on his desk. Concern glimmered in her eyes. "Be careful with your tonics, sir." Hale stiffened. "I always am." But when she left, and the door clicked softly shut, he exhaled a sharp, cracking breath. He was lying. To her. To himself. He uncorked the bottle. The scent rose instantly, sweet, cold, commanding. It brushed against the back of his throat like a whisper of snow. He felt something inside him unravel, some strict line of discipline tremble at its foundation. Just a small inhalation, he told himself. Scientific curiosity. Nothing more. He soaked the corner of a folded cloth, his hands moving with clinical precision, but as he raised the cloth closer, his heartbeat quickened. The flame of the lamp wavered, as if warning him. He hesitated. Then he pressed the cloth lightly against his nose. The effect was immediate, subtle but undeniable. The world softened. The tension in his shoulders slipped away. The lamp's glow blurred into something warm, gentle, tender. He felt suspended, as though lifted slightly out of himself. "Fascinating," he murmured, but the word drifted apart before it left his lips. For a heartbeat, he understood the appeal. The quiet, the float, the absence of sorrow. For one glide of a moment, he almost felt free. Then he pulled the cloth away, breath sharp, eyes stinging. His heart pounded violently, reminded of its duty. Reality snapped back like a taut wire. The room sharpened into clarity again. Desk, lamp, bottles, shadows. He stared at the cloth in fear. He had crossed the line. Just a step, but a step was enough. He rose abruptly, shoving the bottle back into a locked drawer. His breath came unsteady now, threaded with the echo of the sensation he had allowed himself. The silence of the room pressed in around him. He knew what he had done. He knew what it meant. He also knew this was how it began for countless others. Tomorrow, he would treat patients, lecture apprentices, carry himself as the sensible, sober physician he was expected to be. But tonight, he had become something unsettlingly close to them. A man who wondered when he might reach for the bottle again, and when he did, whether he would still be strong enough to stop. The parlor on Hanover Street was a room built for appearances. Lace-curtained windows, wallpaper, the color of faded rose petals, and a marble mantelpiece adorned with porcelain figurines that stared ahead with vacant elegance. It was the sort of room where respectable women gathered for polite conversation, light tea, and measured laughter. And yet, on Thursday afternoons, something unnatural drifted through the air, sweet, shimmering, and slightly illicit. Mrs. Clarissa Whitcomb's ladies' social circle had become famous among certain corners of London society. Officially, the gatherings were meant to be uplifting, an hour of companionship, gentle music, and conversation for women exhausted by the tedium of their domestic lives. But the city had begun to whisper. It was not the lace biscuits or the piano that drew these women week after week. It was the tonic. Clarissa, a woman with perfectly arranged curls and a smile that belonged on a theatre stage, presided over her circle like a benevolent hostess, unaware of her own power. She would glide from guest to guest, refilling delicate glasses with the pale, sparkling liquid she kept in a crystal decanter. She called it her continental restorative, a little marvel she had discovered through a friend of a Parisian acquaintance. Dr. Hale, upon hearing rumours, knew exactly what the decanter contained. Coca wine, an invigorating tonic, a fashionable stimulant, a substance that promised vitality, suppressed hunger, brightened the world and left a shadow behind it. On this particular afternoon, Clarissa's parlour was filled with soft chatter and the clinking of glass. A violin played faintly from the corner, performed by a young cousin too shy to refuse the task, and the room glowed warmly under low lamps that made everything look softer, gentler, dreamier. Mrs. Lydia Pembroke reclined on the fainting sofa, one hand draped gracefully across her forehead. "Clarissa, dear, truly, this tonic is miraculous." Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes too bright. "I have not felt this light in years." Another woman laughed, a breathless trill. "I finished an entire week's mending in a single night. I barely even tired." A third chimed in, swirling the wine in her glass as if it were magic. "And the dreams," she whispered, "so vivid, so beautiful." Clarissa smiled serenely, accepting the praise as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "We deserve a little comfort, do we not? Men have their clubs and cigars. We must have something too." None of the women noticed when the room began to tilt subtly, not physically, but perceptually. The lamplight shimmered with a faint halo. Shadows softened and seemed to breathe. Laughter came too quickly. Words floated upward like ribbons of smoke. They did not realize that the tonic dulled the very force that tethered them to the ground. They were not drunk, nor truly intoxicated. They were untethered. Their worries, anxieties, responsibilities all softened at the edges, reduced to distant shapes in the mist of their own rising euphoria. At precisely this moment, the doorbell chimed. Clarissa gave a flutter of surprise, then smoothed her skirts. "Ah, Dr. Hale, how fortunate you could join us." Gasps murmured around the room. A physician here on a Thursday afternoon. Hale stepped inside, his expression polite, yet tight with concern. He removed his hat, scanning the ladies' flushed faces, the shimmering glasses, the decanter glowing like liquid sunrise. "Mrs. Whitcomb," Hale greeted, bowing slightly. "I was passing through the neighborhood. I hope I am not intruding." "Not at all," Clarissa chimed, pouring him a glass before he could refuse. "Do try the restorative, only a sip. It lifts the spirit wonderfully." Hale lifted the glass, examining the faint opalescence of the liquid. "I've encountered this tonic recently," he said quietly. "I fear it is far stronger than advertised." A hush fell over the parlor. Clarissa's smile stiffened. "Surely you exaggerate, Doctor." Hale lowered the glass without drinking. "Coca extract provides energy at a cost. It sharpens the mind, yes, but it also binds it. Dependence grows quietly. And withdrawal." His gaze drifted over the women, who now watched him with a mixture of confusion and creeping dread. "It can be cruel." Lydia Pembroke paled. Her hand trembled, spilling a droplet of the tonic onto the carpet. Clarissa bristled. "Dr. Hale, these gatherings are private. You are frightening my guests." "I am trying to warn them," Hale replied gently. For a long, strained moment, the room held its breath. Then Lydia whispered, I haven't slept without it in days." Another woman murmured, "I feel hollow when it fades." Clarissa's facade cracked just slightly. Hale set the untouched glass aside. "Ladies, what floats must eventually fall." Silence. Outside, a carriage rumbled past, shaking the window panes. Inside, the women looked at their shimmering glasses, once symbols of dainty pleasure, now with the dawning realization that they had drifted too far from themselves. In Clarissa's parlor, among velvet cushions and gentle music, the first fractures of truth appeared, and for the first time, the housewives of Hanover Street began to wonder whether the comfort they embraced was, in fact, the door to a different kind of captivity. The laboratory of Dr. Erasmus Finch sat perched above a narrow apothecary on Redwater Lane, a cramped upper room with slanted ceilings, a single soot-stained window, and shelves crowded with bottles whose labels had begun to yellow at the edges. At first glance, one might mistake it for the workshop of a clockmaker or a scholar fallen on leaner years. But the air inside told a different story. It shimmered faintly with the sweet bite of chemicals, a scent that clung to the rafters like a lingering sigh. Dr. Finch had acquired a modest reputation among London's medical circles. Brilliant, eccentric, utterly convinced that pain, physical, emotional, existential, was the great enemy of mankind. He sought to banish it not with prayer or philosophy, but with chemicals. Refined chemicals, as he liked to say. Civilized ones. Tonight, as rain pattered against the slanted window, Finch leaned over a porcelain mixing bowl, stirring a pale solution that caught the lamplight like liquid moon. His movements were careful, almost tender. Each drop, he added, each grain he dissolved, was performed with the reverence of a man who believed wholeheartedly in the righteousness of his work. On the table beside him lay a stack of medical journals from Paris and Edinburgh, annotated with furious ink, a clipping about anesthesia, a treatise on hypnotic vapors, a French report claiming that chloroform administered with certain modifications might not merely silence pain, but usher the mind into a state of gentle, blissful sleep. Finch had read the report until the paper tore at the fold. He believed he could go further. He believed he could create something England had never seen, a formula that granted sleep so soft, so serene, that even troubled souls would dream as angels do. He lifted a small glass pipette and allowed a final drop to fall into the mixture. A faint wisp of vapor rose, sweet, floral, almost pleasant. Finch inhaled, closing his eyes, the expression on his face bordering on ecstasy. "This," he whispered to no one, "will change everything." At that moment, a knock sounded from below the apothecary's door. Finch straightened, wiping his hands on his coat as footsteps climbed the stairs. A moment later, the door creaked open and revealed Dr. Jonathan Hale, his coat dripping from the night and his expression drawn. "Erasmus," Hale said, stepping inside, "I hear troubling things." Finch smiled broadly, brushing aside Hale's concern with a wave of his hand. "Ah, Jonathan, come, come, look what I've made." Hale approached cautiously. "I heard a patient of yours slept for 12 hours straight after surgery." 14, Finch corrected proudly. "Is that not magnificent? No pain, no memory of the procedure, only rest." "Too much rest," Hale said quietly. They struggled to wake. Finch chuckled, a brittle, eager sound. The body simply needed time to recover. And why should that disturb us? Most of London is exhausted. They beg for sleep. He lifted the bowl toward Hale, urging him to breathe in the sweet vapor rising from the mixture. Imagine an end to screaming on the operating table. Imagine mothers who can sleep through grief, soldiers through nightmares, laborers through crushing fatigue. This, he gestured around the room, the bottles, the vapors, is progress. Hale stared at the swirling mixture, unease gnawing at him. "What is in it?" Finch's smile stretched wider. "Chloroform, refined with certain botanical extracts, a proprietary blend. It soothes the mind without the violence of ordinary anesthesia. I call it Somnus number 3. Hale forced himself not to recoil. "Have you tested it properly?" "I have," Finch said, though his eyes flickered with something defensive. "A small dose for myself, a greater one for a patient in terrible pain, and soon I shall prepare a demonstration for the medical circle. They will see how gentle sleep can be." Hale stepped back. "Erasmus, you are walking a dangerous line. Chloroform is not a comfort. It is a knife with no blade." Finch's face hardened. "You fear too much, Jonathan, and because of that fear, you are falling behind." The laboratory fell silent except for the rain at the window and the faint hiss of vapor rising from the bowl, a whisper of sweet, damning promise. Hale looked at his colleague at the gleam in Finch's eyes, the trembling excitement of a man who believed he had conquered suffering itself. But all Hale saw was a man standing at the edge of a precipice, mist curling beneath his feet. He turned toward the door, his voice low. "Be careful, Erasmus. Pleasant dreams can still lead to dark places." Finch laughed softly as Hale left, lifting the bowl once more to the lamplight. The vapor shimmered, innocent as perfume. And in that cramped upper room, the inventor of pleasant dreams continued his work, unaware that the city's descent into chemical sleep had already begun. The morning the silence took hold began like any other, a thin grey dawn slipping through the smudged windows of St. Brackwell's Hospital, the muffled shuffle of boots across cold stone floors, and the weary murmurs of nurses who had slept too little and worried too much. Yet there was something strange in the air, something almost reverent, like the hush before a sermon or a storm. By 7 o'clock, the wards were too quiet. The usual cries of pain, the groans from post-surgical patients, the sudden gasps that echoed through the corridors like distant bells gone. In their place hung a fog of stillness so deep it felt unnatural, as if the entire building had fallen under a spell. Nurse Winfield noticed it first. She stood at the threshold of Ward C, her breath curling faintly in the cold air. Rows of patients lay in their beds, their faces serene, their bodies slack beneath white sheets. No one writhed, no one called her name. Even the man who usually sobbed through the mornings now lay motionless, his eyes closed as though the world had finally granted him mercy. Her skin prickled. She moved from bed to bed, checking pulses, brushing hair from clammy brows, adjusting blankets. All alive, but unnaturally so. A few stirred faintly when touched, but drifted back into deeper sleep instantly, as though tethered to a dream they could not escape. Downstairs, in the surgical theatre, Dr. Beckett stood at a metal basin washing his hands, humming an off-key tune. The scent of ether clung to him so strongly it seemed woven into his waistcoat. Behind him, 2 assistant surgeons whispered anxiously. "You gave them how much?" one murmured. "Enough," Beckett replied, his tone clipped with impatience. "The new method quiets them cleanly. No screaming, no thrashing. Surgery becomes a gentleman's craft again." But they will wake? Beckett turned sharply. They always wake. But even as he said it, doubt flickered in his eyes. Word spread quickly through the halls. Patients were not waking on schedule. Several lay in such profound unconsciousness that even ammonia salts failed to rouse them. A boy who had come in for a simple fracture reduction slept so deeply his chest rose only once every long, terrified moment. A mother recovering from an abscess removal whispered nonsense in her sleep, trapped in some dream she could not escape. One man muttered his dead wife's name over and over, but never opened his eyes. Dr. Hale arrived mid-morning, summoned by a frantic note scrawled by Nurse Winfield. He moved through the hospital with growing dread. Ward after ward echoed with the same unnatural quiet, the stillness of a building that had forgotten what pain sounded like. "What is happening?" Hale demanded, when he finally confronted Beckett outside the theatre. Beckett smoothed his gloves with mechanical calm. "Progress, Hale. That is what you are witnessing. A future where suffering no longer delays the surgeon's hand." "This isn't progress," Hale said sharply. "This is sedation without conscience." Beckett's jaw tightened. "You're a romantic, Jonathan. Pain is barbaric. If a deeper sleep is the cost, then so be it." Hale stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Some of them may not wake." For the first time, Beckett faltered. His eyes darted toward the row of closed doors behind Hale. "They will," he said, but the conviction was gone. Nurse Winfield appeared then, breathless. "Doctor, come. There's something you must see." She led them to Ward F, where a young seamstress named Ellen Briggs lay after a minor procedure. Her face was peaceful, but her fingers twitched in frantic, unconscious motions as though she was sewing in her dreams, stitching some invisible fabric that would never finish. Winfield lifted the girl's eyelids. The pupils were thin, fixed, unseeing. Hale felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. "This is not natural sleep," he whispered. "It's the mixture," Winfield murmured. "He's changed it." Beckett bristled. "Controlled trials are necessary." "At what cost?" Hale snapped. "Look around you, man. The hospital has turned into a mausoleum of breathing bodies." Down the hall, a nurse began to cry softly, her sobs muffled by her apron. Another patient murmured in a dream, but the words were shapeless, like fragments torn from a distant storm. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Hale straightened, voice cold and low. "No more of the new mixture. Not one drop. Not in this hospital." Beckett opened his mouth to argue, but the silence around them spoke louder. A silence cobbled from ether and chloroform, from arrogance and ambition, from a city willing to welcome miracles without question. St. Brackwell's had become a cathedral of chemical sleep, and Hale knew with chilling certainty that this was only the beginning. The Whitmore residence on Grosvenor Square was the picture of late Victorian refinement, polished brass knockers, immaculate hedges trimmed to geometric perfection, and a front hall lined with oil portraits of ancestors who stared down from their gilt frames with the disapproving serenity of the dead. Nothing about the exterior suggested disorder. Nothing hinted at the quiet disintegration unfolding behind the elegant facade. Mr. Lionel Whitmore, barrister of excellent pedigree and impeccable public reputation, sat alone in his study as the lamps burned low. The fire snapped unevenly in the grate, throwing shards of light across the bookshelves. The scent of leather, tobacco, and old paper once dominated this room. Now another smell had begun to thread its way through the air, sweet, numbing, unmistakable. Laudanum. The decanter sat on the corner of his desk, its amber contents glinting like captured sunset. Beside it lay the small silver spoon he used to measure his doses, not for tea, not for medicine, but for retreat, for escape. Whitmore leaned heavily against the desk, elbows pressed to polished wood, his usually steady hands trembling as he prepared the next measure. The tremor embarrassed him. It betrayed the meticulous control he prided himself on, but he could not help it. The day had been long, his court arguments fracturing beneath the weight of intrusive fog, his concentration slipping in ways he refused to name. Just a little, he told himself. Enough to sharpen the edges, steady the nerves, bring the world back into something manageable. A gentleman never succumbed to vice. He merely regulated his well-being, or so he told himself. He lifted the spoon. The amber liquid clung to the metal with a thick, honeyed slowness. As he tipped it into his glass, the knock came soft and cautious, like a hand unsure whether it should announce trouble. "Father?" a voice murmured through the door. Whitmore froze. His daughter, Eliza, 16 years old, observant to a fault. He cleared his throat, straightened violently, and swept the laudanum bottle behind a stack of legal papers. "Yes? Come in, my dear." Eliza entered timidly, the lamplight catching the pale worry in her eyes. Her hands clutched a folded shawl, though she did not seem cold. "Mother is concerned," she said softly. "You have not eaten, and the servants say you've been in here for hours." Whitmore forced a smile, one that did not reach his eyes. "Work, my darling, simply work. Cases do not prepare themselves." Her gaze drifted to the glass on his desk, the faint ring of residue along its rim. She said nothing, but her expression changed, just slightly, like a candle flame flickering in an unseen draught. "Will you come downstairs?" she asked. "She misses you." He almost said yes, almost rose from his chair, but the ache behind his eyes pulsed sharply, and the rising tide of unease pressed against his ribs. He needed the tonic's softening haze. He needed to float above the day's noise. He needed relief. "I will join you shortly," he murmured. Eliza nodded, doubt written in the tight line of her mouth. She hesitated on the threshold. "Father, your hands are shaking." Whitmore flinched, tucking them behind his back. "I am simply tired, nothing more." She lingered, then slipped out, closing the door quietly. The latch clicked a sound that cut through the room like guilt. The moment she disappeared, Whitmore exhaled, shoulders collapsing inward. He reached for the hidden bottle with desperate familiarity. The liquid glowed warmly as he poured, promising comfort, promising calm, promising that he would feel like himself again. He swallowed. The world softened. The firelight blurred into gentle halos. The tightness in his chest released. His thoughts drifted into smooth, fluid patterns. Pain dissolved. Doubts dissolved. He leaned back in his chair, eyelids fluttering. But pleasure was a thin veneer. Beneath it lay something colder. As the laudanum threaded through his veins, Whitmore saw shapes move along the edge of his vision, shadows that swayed with a fluidity not entirely due to the flickering fire. He blinked, but the shadows deepened. The study seemed to ripple, the walls bending inward like dark velvet curtains. His breath hitched. A gentleman of standing, of discipline, of intellect, reduced to hiding bottles behind legal texts and trembling at phantoms conjured by a tincture he could no longer deny. Outside his study door, Eliza paused on the staircase, listening. Something, instinct, fear, daughterly intuition held her still. Inside, Lionel Whitmore poured another measure, just to even the tide, just to feel steady, just to be himself again, whatever himself meant now. The fire crackled softly, filling the silent house with the illusion of warmth. And, in the heart of Grosvenor Square, behind lace curtains and inherited pride, another London household quietly surrendered to the fog. The attic room above the Bramwell tailoring shop was small enough that a single breath seemed to fill it. Its slanted ceiling pressed low, trapping dust motes in the stale air. The walls bore faint outlines of old water stains, and the lone window so narrow it resembled a slit in a fortress, let in a thin strand of London's ashen daylight. It was hardly a room meant for comfort, yet it belonged to Ruby Clark, a seamstress of nimble fingers and secrets stitched far more tightly than any hem she ever completed. Ruby sat on the edge of her cot that evening, hands raw from sewing, knuckles aching with the dull, unending throb that came from labor done too fast and for too long. She rubbed her palms together, wincing as the pain flared. Below her feet, the floorboards creaked with each shift of her weight, as though the old wood knew every worry she carried and complained on her behalf. But the ache that consumed her thoughts wasn't in her hands. It stirred beneath her ribs, a deeper hunger she feared more than she understood. She reached toward the loose plank in the floor. The board lifted with a practiced ease, revealing the small, clandestine hollow space below. Wrapped in an old handkerchief lay the object she sought, her bottle. Dark glass, no label. Only the thin cork and the sweet, sharp scent that lingered even through the cloth. Ruby swallowed hard, her throat tightening with a mixture of longing and shame. Morphine drops. A gift, if such a word could be used, from a former customer, a woman with trembling hands and an empty purse, who whispered that the mixture made the world feel lighter, more distant, more bearable. Ruby had refused at first, then accepted out of curiosity, then out of need. Now she kept it hidden under the floorboard, away from Mrs. Bramwell's sharp eyes and sharper temper, away from the city's judgment, away from anyone who might take it from her. Tonight, the pain in her hands throbbed like a heartbeat. She closed her eyes, trying to resist the pull. Just a drop, she told herself. One drop to quiet the ache. One drop to silence the thoughts that chased her into sleepless hours. She uncorked the bottle. The scent rose instantly, sweet, warm, like wilted flowers soaked in sugar. It pressed itself against her senses with familiar tenderness. Ruby dipped the glass stopper and let a single bead fall onto her tongue. Relief came quickly, too quickly. Her shoulders loosened. The attic's cramped walls seemed to widen. The thread of pain running through her body softened, then dissolved entirely. The world, which had pressed down on her like an iron weight moments before, lightened to something she could almost float above. Ruby leaned back on her thin pillow, exhaling a long, trembling breath. The muffled clatter of the shop downstairs softened into a comforting hum. The cold draft from the window no longer bothered her. Even the distant street sounds, the rumbling carriage wheels, the bark of a passing vendor blurred into gentle, colorless noise. She drifted. Yet beneath the relief, a shadow curled, a quiet warning she tried desperately to ignore. The bottle glinted from the handkerchief, its dark shape luminous in the dim light. It hadn't always looked so inviting. At first, it had frightened her. Now it felt like the only thing in London that noticed her pain, that cared for her, that wrapped its soft arms around the pieces of herself she didn't dare show to anyone else. Her eyes fluttered open. She thought she saw movement, a slight ripple at the edge of the room. But when she focused, the wall stood still. The shadows lingered innocently. She blinked, uncertain whether the bottle had blurred her perception or drawn her deeper into its silent embrace. A sudden knock startled her. "Ruby," Mrs. Bramwell's sharp voice pierced through the floorboards. "You're late finishing that waistcoat. I want it in my hand within the hour." Ruby jolted upright, the room spinning just slightly. The warmth in her veins turned slick, unsteady. She scrambled to return the bottle to its hiding place, her fingers clumsy. The floorboards slid back into place just as footsteps thudded up the stairs. "I'm coming," Ruby called, breath shaky. In the dim attic light, she smoothed her hair, straightened her dress, forced her trembling legs to carry her forward. But the softness still swirled within her, the fog that made reality feel padded, distant. As she opened the door to descend, she cast one last glance at the floorboard. The bottle lay beneath it, silent and patient. Waiting. Ruby stepped into the stairwell, her movements light, her heart heavy. She told herself she controlled it. But in the quietness beneath the floorboard, the bottle knew otherwise. The fog pressed heavily against the windows of the Millhaven tenement, turning the glass milky and indistinct. Its dim light seeped into the narrow rooms like a tired ghost, softening edges, muting colors, and casting long shadows that crept across the floorboards as if searching for warmth. In one of the corner rooms, bare, small, and perpetually cold, a child lay curled beneath a thin blanket, coughing with a sound far too soft for the illness that gripped him. Little Thomas Hale, no relation to the doctor, though fate enjoyed such small ironies, had been coughing for weeks. At first, it was merely a tickle in his throat, a nighttime nuisance, but the fog had settled deep that winter, heavy with soot and damp, and each day the cough grew quieter, as if wearing him down from the inside. His mother, Nora Hale, sat beside him, her hands trembling as she pressed a damp cloth to his forehead. "Just rest, love," she whispered, though her words wavered. "Just rest a bit longer." But rest did not come easily. Thomas's breaths were shallow, uneven, punctuated by small gasps that twisted like knives in his mother's chest. The door behind her creaked open, and Mrs. Pembury, her elderly neighbour, entered with a bundle clutched in her hands. She smelled faintly of camphor and peppermint oil, as most older women did in London's poorer quarters. "I brought something for the boy," Mrs. Pembury said, holding out the small bottle as though offering salvation, "to soothe his lungs. It's what they gave my nephew when he had the same trouble." Nora accepted it without thinking, without daring not to think. The label was faded, but she recognized the name. Mother Winslow's Soothing Syrup. The very same syrup she had seen advertised on street posters and in penny newspapers, boasting its usefulness for calming fretful children, for easing pain, for silencing tears, for soothing coughs. Nora uncorked the bottle. The scent rose sweet and floral, with a faint bitterness beneath it. It smelled safe. It smelled gentle. She dipped a small spoon inside. Thomas stirred weakly, his lashes trembling. He opened his eyes just enough to see the silhouette of the bottle. "Mama, it's medicine," she whispered, "to help you sleep." She placed the spoon against his lips. He swallowed obediently, too tired to protest. The effect was immediate, too immediate. Thomas's body relaxed, sinking deeper into the mattress. His breathing evened, each inhale drifting like a whisper. His eyelids fell shut, not heavily, but softly, as though coaxed downward by invisible hands. "He'll sleep now," Mrs. Pembury said, relieved. "A few drops does wonders. Children need rest." Nora nodded, though unease stirred beneath her ribs. She stroked Thomas's cheek. He did not stir. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The tenement's draft whistled beneath the door, chilling the room further. Thomas did not wake. His cough no longer filled the air, not even as a faint rattle. The silence was too complete, too perfect. Nora leaned closer, her breath shaking. "Thomas, sweetheart?" No response. She touched his shoulder, but his body remained limp, a softness that felt almost unnatural. Panic flared in her throat. She shook him gently. Then, less gently. "Thomas!" His lashes fluttered. Barely. A sliver of breath escaped his lips. Mrs. Pembury paled. "Maybe. Just a little too much," she stammered. "It calms them, you see. Makes them quiet." Quiet. Yes, that was the promise. A syrup that silenced babies, soothed toddlers, hushed children just enough for exhausted parents to breathe. But no one spoke of the laudanum inside, or the morphine, or the children who slipped too deeply, too swiftly, into stillness. Nora clutched her son to her chest, trembling. "I need a doctor," she whispered, her voice cracking with desperation. The tenement stairs seemed to stretch endlessly beneath her feet as she ran. Down in the street, fog swallowed her cries. Upstairs, in the dim attic room, the bottle sat uncorked, its sweet scent rising into the cold air. It glowed with innocent calmness, an illusion, a trap, a comfort with a razor edge. Thomas lay silent, breath faint and wavering. Outside, a carriage clattered distantly through the mist. Inside, London's latest miracle remedy waited patiently in the quiet, its promises written in cursive letters and its warnings hidden between the lines. And in the small, trembling breaths of a sick child, the operating theatre at Kensworth Hospital had always been a grim sort of cathedral, its high, domed ceiling collecting the echoes of whispered prayers, its tall windows filtering daylight into thin, mournful beams. The iron platform at the centre, fitted with leather straps and stained linen, was the altar upon which men entrusted their bodies to science and sometimes to mercy. The walls bore the faint shadows of past procedures, as if the room itself remembered every incision, every scream, every silence. But on the morning of the operation that would later be whispered through London's corridors, the theatre felt even colder. A damp fog pressed against the glass, blurring the world outside into a pale smear of grey. The lamps hissed faintly as they were lit one by one. Nurses moved with the mechanical precision of women, trained to swallow their dread. The scent of disinfectant mingled with something sweeter, an aroma that clung to the cloths soaking in silver basins. Ether, freshly prepared. Chloroform, carefully measured. A mixture no surgeon should have touched and yet so many now relied on. Dr. Charles Rathbone, the hospital's rising star, and a man who had grown far too enamored with his own ambition, stood at the centre of the room with a posture bordering on theatrical. His hair was slicked back, his moustache freshly trimmed, his gloves snapped as he adjusted them, the sound sharp in the sterile air. On the table lay Mr. Oliver Bramcote, a middle-aged clerk whose gallstone trouble had landed him here after months of agony. He trembled beneath the thin linens, eyes darting across the room with the frantic awareness of a man who felt doom approaching. "Steady now," Rathbone said, voice smoothed with practiced reassurance. "You're in capable hands. This will all be over quite gently." The nurse holding the chloroform cloth hesitated. She had heard rumours. She had seen the aftermath of the new method. But Rathbone's glare silenced her hesitation. With trembling fingers, she dipped the cloth into the basin, where ether and chloroform mingled in a glistening pool. Mr. Bramcote inhaled. Once, twice. Then his body slackened with unnatural speed. Too fast. Rathbone did not notice or did not care. He motioned for the scalpel. The first incision was swift, almost elegant. But the moment the blade broke skin, a ripple of unease ran through the theatre. Bramcote did not move, did not twitch, did not grunt or tighten his jaw. His chest rose faintly, but the breath seemed reluctant, fading. "Doctor," whispered Nurse Alder, her voice thin as thread. His pulse. "Continue," Rathbone insisted, irritation flaring. "He's merely deeply under. This is ideal." It was not ideal. It was catastrophic. Within minutes, Bramcote's face turned ashen. His breathing grew shallow enough to be mistaken for stillness. A cold sweat clung to his brow. A tremor ran through the attending staff. "Something's wrong," another nurse whispered. Rathbone's jaw tightened as he pressed fingers to the man's throat. The pulse fluttered like a dying moth. "Administer more ether," he barked an order so grotesquely misguided that even the air seemed to still in disbelief. "No," Nurse Alder whispered, voice shaking. "He won't survive it." Rathbone seized the cloth himself. "I will not lose a patient to cowardice." He pressed the cloth down. Gasps erupted around the room. Moments later, what little breath Bramcote still clung to slipped away. His body sagged, his jaw falling slack. The silence that followed was suffocating, deeper than grief, heavier than shock. It was an accusation. Rathbone stepped back, face strained. His hands trembled despite the controlled mask he tried to maintain. He muttered something about complications and weak constitutions, but the nurses knew. They had seen the truth. and it spread through the hospital by dusk like wildfire. This death could not be hidden. By the next morning, the newspapers had the story, though softened for public digestion. Unexpected failure during advanced anesthesia trial. Hospital tragedy raises concerns. A respected surgeon faces inquiry. But those inside London's medical halls spoke with sharper tongues. They spoke of recklessness, of ego, of a mixture no one fully understood being wielded like a miracle cure. Meetings were called, statements demanded. Politicians who had ignored the rising tide of chemical misuse now feigned alarm and moral poise. A child's syrup had nearly taken lives. Hospitals had turned into echoing chambers of sleep. Housewives drifted through afternoons, lifted by tonics. And now, a man ordinary, working, human, had died publicly on the table of what was meant to save him. Something had to be done. And so, under pressure from the frightened wealthy and the outraged poor alike, Parliament drafted the beginnings of the first regulations on chemical anesthetics, an attempt to set boundaries around the very substances that had slipped so easily into London's bloodstream. It would not stop the fog from rising. But for the first time, someone tried to name it. Margaret Bramcote had always kept her home in perfect order, curtains washed weekly, brass polished until it shone like captured sunlight, and the tea service arranged with such precision that visitors often whispered she must have been trained in some great country estate. She was not. She simply believed that a tidy house kept sorrow at bay. But sorrow does not knock. It enters uninvited. On the afternoon she learned her husband was dead, the house felt strangely hollow, like a room whose furniture had been removed while she slept. The messenger from Kensworth Hospital stood stiffly in the doorway, hat clutched in trembling hands, his expression contorted by guilt he had no responsibility to bear. "I am deeply sorry, Mrs. Bramcote," he had said, voice cracking. "Your husband, the operation was not successful." Not successful. As if a failed court plea or a burnt roast. Not a life lost. Not a future crumpled into ash. After his departure, Margaret closed the door quietly, almost tenderly, as though any loud sound would shatter what remained of her world. She walked to the sitting room, sank into her husband's favourite chair, and folded her hands in her lap. They trembled violently. Oliver's spectacles still rested on the mantel. His half-read newspaper lay on the table, folded neatly beside his pipe. The scent of last night's tobacco clung faintly to the air, warm and familiar. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle the sound clawing its way up her throat. "He was only meant to be gone for the morning," she whispered. Her neighbour, Mrs. Dunley, arrived shortly afterward, uninvited but expected, like most well-meaning people in moments of tragedy. She swept into the room with excessive sympathy, her lace shawl fluttering dramatically, her mouth pinched in a permanent expression of disapproval toward the world. "Oh, my dear Margaret," she exclaimed, taking the widow's hands in her own. "Such a tragedy, such awfulness." She paused, fishing for the right words. "At least he did not suffer." Margaret's eyes flashed. "How would you know?" Mrs. Dunley blinked. The widow's voice trembled, but not from fragility, from something sharper. "They told me nothing, nothing beyond that. It was unexpected, a word that means they don't know, or they won't say." Mrs. Dunley squeezed her hands in what she believed was comfort. "Hospitals are complicated places. Mistakes happen." "Mistakes?" Margaret repeated, tasting the bitterness of the word. Her jaw tightened. Oliver walked into that place, alive. The neighbour faltered, then abruptly brightened, as though bringing good news. "I brought you something." She reached into her reticule and produced a small vial, pretty glass, tied with a lavender ribbon. "It's a tonic, very soothing. It will help you sleep. Everyone is using it now. You mustn't wear yourself down with grieving." Margaret stared at the bottle. She had heard whispers in the market of women drifting through their mourning wrapped in chemical softness, of grief blurred by syrup, by powders, by miraculous tonics promising rest. But something inside her resisted the idea of surrendering her sorrow to the very world that had taken her husband. "No," she said quietly, "I won't take it." Mrs. Dunley blinked, stunned. "But dear—" "No," Margaret said again, her voice hardening. "I want to feel what I feel. I want to remember him properly." Mrs. Dunley opened her mouth to argue, but saw something fierce in the widow's eyes and thought better of it. With a clumsy pat on Margaret's hands, she muttered some half-hearted farewell and left the room, shawl fluttering behind her. Silence descended once more, heavy and unkind. Margaret rose slowly and crossed the sitting room. She picked up Oliver's spectacles, holding them as though they might dissolve at her touch. The weight of them grounded her. A small, fragile anchor in a world that had suddenly lost its shape. Her gaze drifted to the small clock on the mantel, the one Oliver wound each night. It ticked softly, steadily, as though nothing had changed. Margaret pressed the spectacles to her chest. "Something happened," she whispered. "Something they're not telling me." Outside, London's fog thickened, swallowing the lamplights one by one. The city sighed, oblivious to her grief. But Margaret Bramcote stood in the dim quiet of her sitting room, refusing the soporific comfort offered to every widow in her position. She felt every tremor, every tear, every breath like a wound, and through it all, a resolve began to form. She would not fade into the chemical haze that swallowed so many others. She would not drift quietly into soft oblivion. She would find out what happened on that table at Kensworth Hospital. And if someone was responsible, the widow whispered to the empty room, they will answer. Mr. Tobias Greeley's apothecary on Fosterwick Lane was the sort of place that looked harmless at first glance, narrow, cramped, its windows fogged with condensation from simmering tinctures and steaming tonics. The little brass bell above the door chimed softly whenever a customer entered, a sound so delicate it seemed afraid to disturb the dust imprinted into every corner. Glass jars lined the shelves from floor to ceiling, lavender blossoms, powdered chalk, paregoric, peppermint lozenges, tincture of opium, eucalyptus gum. Labels, penned in Mr. Greeley's precise handwriting, faced forward like polite faces at church. And yet, beneath the scent of crushed herbs and drying roots, something else clung to the air. Something sharper, something that did not belong in a respectable shop. Ether, chloroform, coca extract, morphine in its many quiet disguises. Tobias Greeley, thin and pale as a candle left burning too long, moved behind the counter with a quiet urgency born from secrets carefully stacked over the years. His eyes always seemed to flick toward the shadows, as though expecting someone or something to emerge from them. This morning, when the bell tinkled, he stiffened. Margaret Bramcote stepped into the shop. She wore black, not the theatrical satin favoured by fashionable widows, but a simple wool deepened to the darkest shade the cloth could hold. Her gloves were neatly buttoned, her posture straight despite the exhaustion scrawled across her features. There was no trembling, no softness, only determination sharpened to a fine edge. "Mrs. Bramcote," Greeley greeted, bowing his head. "Please accept my—" "I am not here for condolences," she said, gently but firmly. Greeley swallowed. "Very well. How may I help you?" She stepped forward, eyes scanning the shelves with unsettling precision. "I want to know what substances Kensworth Hospital has been purchasing lately, particularly those used during operations." Greeley's breath caught. "Mrs. Bramcote, I am merely a supplier. You keep records," she interrupted. "Apothecaries always do." Greeley's fingers twitched toward the ledger beneath his counter, the one bound in dark leather and etched with the faint scars of ink and time. He did not touch it. His voice lowered to a whisper. "Those records are confidential." Margaret leaned closer, her voice even softer. "My husband walked into that hospital alive. He died under a surgeon's hand. and I believe someone in this city knows why." Greeley closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, fear flickered there, fear of truth, fear of retribution, fear of the world he supplied without fully controlling. "Mrs. Bramcote," he said, voice nearly trembling, "you must understand that people in my profession are pressured. Hospitals demand stronger agents. Surgeons insist on larger quantities. They call it advancement, progress, a new age of medicine. And he swallowed, I provide what is requested." "What did Kensworth request?" she asked calmly. Greeley hesitated too long. Margaret's gaze hardened. "Please." That one word, whispered with grief wrapped in steel, broke him. He reached beneath the counter, retrieving the ledger with trembling hands. Its spine creaked as he opened it to recent entries. He turned the book so Margaret could read. Her eyes swept over the lists, bottles ordered in staggering amounts. Ether spirits, 4 crates. Chloroform liniment, 2 cases. Somnus, number 3, 2 dozen vials. Tinct. Opium, 1 case. She blinked. "Somnus? Number 3? What is that?" Greeley flinched. "A new preparation. Experimental. A blend of chloroform and botanicals designed to deepen unconsciousness." He paused, voice dropping. "Dr. Erasmus Finch created it." Margaret's breath tightened. "Was this used at Kensworth?" Greeley nodded once, slowly. "How dangerous is it?" Greeley's lips parted, but he did not answer at once. His eyes drifted toward the shuttered window, toward the street where fog muffled footsteps and kept the world half hidden. Finally he whispered, "If given wrong even slightly, it can stop a man's breath with the softness of a lullaby." Margaret's fingers curled around the counter's edge. "And you sold it to them?" "I had no choice," Greeley muttered, shame staining his voice. "Hospitals carry influence. They can ruin a small apothecary with a single complaint, and Finch convinced them it was the future." Margaret shut the ledger, gently but firmly. "You will not destroy those records," she said. Greeley looked at her, startled. "Destroy them? I wouldn't dare. They protect me, more than they expose." Margaret's eyes burned with quiet resolve. "No, they will protect my husband's memory." She stepped back. "And when the inquiry begins, and it will begin, you will tell them the truth." Greeley paled. "Mrs. Bramcote, speaking openly, may cost me my livelihood." Margaret's voice softened, but it did not lose its strength. "It cost my husband his life." Silence settled between them, a heavy, suffocating hush broken only by the ticking of the wall clock. Finally, Greeley bowed his head. "I will come forward," he whispered. "God help me." Margaret nodded. She turned toward the door, but before leaving, she looked back. "And Mr. Greeley?" He lifted his eyes. "You may have been afraid, but today you chose to stand with the truth. Do not lose that courage." With that, she stepped into the fog and disappeared. Greeley closed the ledger with trembling hands, aware that by helping her, he had crossed a line from which there was no return. But for the first time in years, the apothecary felt the faintest whisper of relief, like a room airing out after too many hours of chemical haze. He whispered to himself, "Let the truth come." London's fog bowed against the window as though listening. Rumours in London did not travel like polite conversation. They moved like fog, slow at first, curling around lampposts and gutters, then thickening until they seeped beneath every door and into every parlour, every tavern, every whispered exchange between neighbours, pretending not to eavesdrop. And on the narrow stretch of Belgrave Passage, one of those cramped, twisting streets where the cobblestones always glistened as if the city were perspiring, rumours travelled faster than carriage wheels on wet stone. It began with Mrs. Linton, who ran the seamstress shop at the corner. She was a woman with sharp elbows, sharper opinions, and a talent for gathering information without seeming to try. By mid-morning she had already heard that something had gone terribly wrong at Kensworth Hospital. By noon she had added details, some true, some invented, all whispered with relish. By dusk she had told the butcher, the baker, the lamplighter, and anyone who paused long enough to catch her eye. "They say a man died on the table," she told Mrs. Hawthorne, breathless as she arranged ribbons in the window. "Not from the knife, no, from whatever those doctors are using to make people sleep. Too much of it, or perhaps the wrong sort altogether." Mrs. Hawthorne gasped. "Sleep shouldn't kill anybody." "One would think," Mrs. Linton replied darkly. "But hospitals are full of surprises these days." Just across the street, the Wilkes brothers newsboys with perpetual soot-stained cheeks shouted headlines they didn't fully understand. "Hospital mystery. New anesthetic raises questions. Is London medicine safe? Was it neglect or something worse?" The boys had no idea. Their cries carried grief straight into the hearts of those who passed by. Men paused to frown. Women pulled their shawls tighter around them. Mothers tightened their grip on their children's hands. And in the flats above the cobbler's shop, Mrs. Durant, the city's most thorough gossip, compiled everything she'd heard into an elaborate tale involving a corrupt surgeon, a forbidden chemical, and a ghost haunting Kensworth's operating theatre. By evening, half the block believed the hospital was performing experiments on the poor. Later that same day, as twilight washed the street in bruised shades of blue and violet, Dr. Jonathan Hale made his way down Belgrave Passage with his collar turned up against the cold. He had visited the Bramcote home earlier, offering what comfort he could to the newly widowed Margaret, but comfort felt thin, insufficient. Paper over a wound that bled beneath it. Now he walked with the unease of a man feeling the ground shift beneath him. Voices followed him like shadows. "Did you hear? They say it was the chloroform. A new mixture. Some experimental concoction. Men of science meddling again. Someone ought to put a stop to it." Hale clenched his jaw. Secrets, terrible ones, were spilling into the streets faster than he could address them. And secrecy, he knew, was the one thing men like Dr. Beckett relied upon. If the city whispered too loudly, if questions grew too pointed, the carefully controlled quiet of the medical world might crack. He paused outside Mrs. Linton's seamstress shop. She noticed him instantly, her eyes bright with the sort of curiosity that could slice through armor. "Dr. Hale," she called sweetly, stepping outside with exaggerated grace. "Quite the stir your colleagues have caused. And you must know something. You always do." "I know only that a man has died," Hale replied evenly. "Then the rumors are true?" she pressed, her voice sharpening. Hale's silence was answer enough. Mrs. Linton leaned closer, lowering her voice. "People are frightened. Mothers won't take their children to the infirmary. Men refuse to go for treatment. They say doctors are testing concoctions on them." Hale's stomach twisted. "No one is being tested on," he said quietly. "But mistakes have been made. Grave ones." Mrs. Linton crossed her arms, her expression tightening. "Then tell that to the city. If the truth doesn't come from you, it'll come from the street, and the street exaggerates everything." Hale knew she was right. Already the rumors spread with a life of their own. Soon they'd swell beyond control. Suddenly, a thin voice cracked through the chatter. Dr. Hale. A small boy, Thomas Hale's younger cousin, ran toward him, face flushed, breath coming in sharp bursts. Hale knelt as the boy reached him. "It's Thomas," the child gasped. "Aunt Nora says, come quick, he's not waking up." The world tilted. The reassuring noise of the street, the gossip, the clatter of carts, the shouts of newsboys, faded into a dull hum. Hale stood abruptly, heart pounding violently against his ribs. Not another child. Not another casualty of London's quiet chemical war. "Take me to him," Hale said. The boy grabbed his hand, tugging him through the fog-thick street. Mrs. Linton watched them disappear, her expression shifting from curiosity to alarm. And just like that, the rumor changed. "Another one," she whispered to herself. By nightfall, Belgrave Passage would repeat the news like a prayer or a curse. Another victim, another warning, another life hovering between sleep and something darker. London's fog swallowed Dr. Hale and the child whole, and the street kept whispering louder now, because secrets were beginning to slip from the shadows and the city was finally listening. The Hale residence sat on a narrow, sloping street near the river, an aging townhouse whose dark brick exterior absorbed more fog than sunlight. Inside, the candles always seemed to burn a little dimmer, as though the walls themselves were reluctant to reflect the light. Dr. Jonathan Hale had once considered it a refuge, a sanctuary where the world's noise softened into mere background murmur. Tonight, it felt like a confessional cell with no priest and no absolution. He entered through the side door, collapsing his medical bag onto the kitchen table. His coat was damp with fog. His hands still shook from examining little Thomas Hale, whose small chest rose in fragile, uneven breaths. The child lived for now, but the syrup had pulled him dangerously close to the edge of that cold, silent border Jonathan had seen too often. He rubbed his face, feeling the exhaustion settle into his bones like wet sand. Another one, he thought. Another innocent drifting into the chemical fog. He had seen too many patients slipping away under ether or chloroform, seen mothers drifting in and out of morphine illusions, seen respectable men losing their grip on reality through laudanum. And now, children whose only crime was trusting the remedies sold by smiling shopkeepers and endorsed by newspapers. The house was quiet except for the faint tick of the clock in the hall. Hale removed his gloves, dropped them onto a chair, and stared at his trembling hands. Not from cold, not from fear, from rage. "For God's sake," he muttered, voice cracking. "How much more must this city endure?" He moved toward the parlor, where the lamp's glow revealed the disarray he had left in his earlier haste papers scattered, anatomy texts open to half-read pages, notes scribbled with desperate urgency. He swept them aside, pacing the length of the carpet, as though movement might calm him. It didn't. Images flashed through his mind, Margaret Bramcote's tear-lined eyes, Greeley's trembling confession, the silent wards of St. Brackwell's, Thomas's limp body. He sank into his armchair. Enough. 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 The word pulsed behind his eyes. He leaned forward, elbows braced on his knees. His thoughts coiled tightly around one truth. He was losing patients not to disease, not to infection, not to the natural order of life and death, but to men who called themselves innovators. Beckett with his reckless ether mixtures, Finch with his somnus, Number 3, his alchemical dream poison, apothecaries pressured into compliance, hospitals hungry for prestige, polite society eager for comfort without consequence. They had turned London into a garden watered with chemicals instead of rain, and the city drank greedily. Hale clenched his fists. He rose abruptly, nearly knocking the lamp from the table, and strode to the locked cabinet in the corner of the room. He had placed the bottle he tested upon himself there, his shame hidden behind polished oak. He fumbled for the key, hands trembling not from desire but from fury. He unlocked the cabinet. The smell of ether wafted faintly from within, haunting him. He slammed it shut again. "No," he whispered. "I will not join them." He locked the door with a decisive snap and pocketed the key. Footsteps echoed from the stairwell. Mrs. Dalloway, his housekeeper, stood on the bottom step with a candle in hand. Her expression was drawn with worry. "Doctor, you're pacing the floors like a hunted man. Should I prepare something warm?" Hale shook his head. "No, I need clarity, not comfort." She hesitated. "You look unwell." "I am tired," he admitted, "tired of burying what should be living." Her eyes softened, sorrow settling in their depths. She had worked for him long enough to know the weight he carried not just of work, but of conscience. She set the candle down. "You cannot save the entire city, sir." Hale exhaled slowly. "Then I will save what I can, and expose who threatens them." Mrs. Dalloway nodded, the faintest spark of pride in her gaze. "Do what you must. I'll stand with you." When she retreated upstairs, Hale returned to the dining table. He opened a fresh sheet of paper and dipped his pen into the inkwell with steadying breaths. He began to write. A report to Parliament, a denunciation of unregulated anaesthetics, a record of what happened to Thomas, a description of Stamwell Hospital's silent wards, a plea and a warning. The pen scratched furiously across the page, the ink pooling as his hand moved with purpose. If the city won't protect its people, Hale thought, then I will force its hand. The fog pressed against the window pane, wrapping the house in heavy silence. Inside, for the first time in weeks, Hale felt something anchor in him, not despair, not fear. Resolve. A hard, unyielding resolve that burned hotter than the lamp's dim flame. "Let them come," he whispered. "Let the truth come out." And in the quiet of the room, the words felt like the beginning of a fight he could no longer turn away from. Mr. Elliot Pruitt's laboratory, if one could call the cramped, cluttered room behind his shop, a laboratory, had always smelled of peppermint, camphor, and chalk dust. Tonight, however, when Mrs. Denham from the neighbouring bakery knocked on his back door to return a misplaced crate, she paused. The air held none of those familiar scents. It smelled instead of cold metal and something faintly sweet, the ghost of a vapour that had not dissipated entirely. She knocked again. No answer. The silence pressed against her like a weight. Elliot Pruitt was not the sort of man who left doors unanswered. He lived alone, kept meticulous hours, and rarely strayed more than 10 steps from his mixing table. Mrs. Denham pushed the door open a crack. "Mr. Pruitt?" she called gently. "Are you here?" Her voice hung unanswered in the stillness. Inside, the lanterns were dark, save for a single one left burning on the workbench, its weak flame tossing jittery shadows across the room. Glass beakers glittered faintly in the unstable light, but the usual order, the careful arrangement of vials by size and purpose, was gone. Bottles stood uncorked, papers lay scattered, a chair was knocked over, a drawer hung open as if tugged in haste. Something had happened here. Mrs. Denham's breath caught as she noticed a dark smear along the edge of the workbench, faint but unmistakable. Spilled tincture? Ink? She leaned closer. Blood. Her hands flew to her mouth. She fled into the street, calling for help. By dawn, half the neighborhood had crowded around the little shop, their whispers gathering like a storm. Gone without a word. Left everything behind. They say the back door was broken from the outside. No, from the inside it splintered inward. Someone must have taken him. Or silenced him. Police constables arrived, shooing onlookers aside. They stepped into the dim laboratory with stiff backs and expressions that suggested they already wished to be elsewhere. Dr. Jonathan Hale arrived shortly after them. He had been meeting with the Hales' grieving mother when young Thomas stirred slightly weak but alive. Relief had flooded him, but it was accompanied by a cold realization. The syrup he had examined bore signs of tampering, too potent, too concentrated, far beyond any standard preparation. Someone had altered the formula, and the name stamped on the bottom of the bottle was one he recognized. Pruitt and Sons, chemical suppliers. So he had come here, to the chemist's door, praying to find answers. Instead, he found absence. Constable Merrick approached him, hat in hand. "Dr. Hale, didn't expect to see you here." "I have questions for Mr. Pruitt," Hale replied, scanning the room. "Important ones." Merrick cleared his throat. "You and the rest of London." "He's gone." Hale stepped closer to the workbench. Fingertips brushed the edge of the spilled droplet. Old blood. Not enough to suggest death, but enough to suggest violence. "What happened?" Hale asked tightly. That's just it, Merrick said. No one knows. Door was ajar at dawn. Neighbors heard nothing. Nothing broken or stolen, except... He hesitated. Except what? Hale pressed. His formula books. Hale stiffened. Formula books? Merrick nodded grimly. 3 volumes. Locked drawers smashed open. Not a page left behind. Hale's stomach curled painfully. Formulas. Recipes. Measurements of opiates, chloroform, ether mixtures. Pruitt had supplied half the hospitals in the district. If someone wanted to cover their tracks, tearing out the roots of evidence would be a convenient place to start. He mentioned concerns, Merrick went on, voice low. Said he'd been approached by certain men, surgeons who wanted stronger mixtures, faster ones that quieted patients almost instantly. Hale felt a chill spread through him. Finch, Beckett, and others like them, ambitious, reckless, hungry for renown. And now he's vanished, Hale murmured. Merrick nodded. Without his notes, we can't prove anything. Hale ran a hand through his hair, breath trembling. The missing books, the tampered syrup, the silent wards, the rise in deaths, it was all part of a pattern, a spreading shadow. Someone was manipulating formulas to dangerous potency, and they were willing to remove anyone who stood too close to the truth. Hale's gaze drifted back to the single lantern burning on the bench. Its flame flickered once, then steadied. He didn't leave willingly, Hale said quietly. No, Merrick agreed, but I'm not convinced he's dead either. The constable leaned closer, voice dropping to a whisper. Sometimes a disappearance is meant to buy time, or silence a man before he speaks. Hale turned toward the door, resolve hardening like steel. If Pruitt had been taken, there was a reason. Someone feared what he knew. Someone feared what he could prove. And Hale knew he could no longer move cautiously. The city's shadows were swallowing people. Now chemists, patients, innocent children. London was unraveling. And whatever force stood behind the experimentation, the altered chemicals, the silent deaths, was becoming bolder. He stepped into the fog-thick street, his breath forming a cold cloud before him. I will find him, Hale whispered to himself. And I will bring the truth with me. The Bramcote home had become a place of whispers. Even with the curtains drawn tight against the creeping London fog, Margaret could feel the city pressing against the windows, pressing with questions, rumours, condolences spoken too lightly, and pity spoken too loudly. Every knock upon the door felt like an intrusion. Every letter felt like a verdict. Every sorrowing face seemed to suggest she should sink quietly into widowhood, softened by syrups and soothed by powders, until her grief blurred into something society found easier to stomach. But Margaret Bramcote did not fade. She sharpened. On this particular morning, she stood at the front window, her silhouette stark against the pale light. The black crepe of her mourning dress hung elegantly but severely, like armor tailored from sorrow. Her hands, folded in front of her, did not tremble, not anymore. Grief had settled into her bones, but it had crystallized into purpose. Behind her, the parlor clock struck 9. The sound echoed through the room, meeting the silence like a challenge. She turned as Mrs. Greenfield, a family friend, entered carrying a silver tray of tea and biscuits. The older woman's face was lined with worry, her shoulders drooping beneath a shawl that smelled faintly of lavender. She set the tray down, eyes softening. "You should rest, dear Margaret," she urged. "You've hardly slept. The strain is too much for any one woman." Margaret lifted her chin. "Rest can wait. Truth cannot." Mrs. Greenfield sighed. "What truth are you hoping to find? Doctors make mistakes. Hospitals are busy. Sometimes—" "No," Margaret interjected, her voice like iron dipped in honey. This was not a mistake. Mrs. Greenfield hesitated, wringing her hands. "And what will you do? Confront the hospitals? Challenge the surgeons?" That is not a woman's fight. Then it is time a woman made it hers. Her tone left no room for argument. Mrs. Greenfield stared at her, a flicker of awe breaking through her fear. Margaret walked to Oliver's writing desk, its surface still strewn with papers he had not lived long enough to put away. She rested a hand on the leather-bound ledger she had taken from Mr. Greeley's apothecary. The chemist's confession echoed in her mind. Somnus, number 3. A new anesthetic, a dangerous one, supplied in secret, administered without restraint. And her husband had died under it. She opened the ledger, scanning the orders once more. Something new caught her eye, an annotation in Greeley's careful script. Kensworth, urgent delivery. Twice the usual measure. Her breath sharpened. Twice. Twice the amount they normally used, twice the risk, twice the danger, twice the chance the mixture would drown a man in sleep and never return him. She closed the ledger, fury stirring beneath her ribs. Mrs. Greenfield, watching her, sat gently beside her. Margaret, if you dig into this, you may not like what you find. Then let it be ugly, Margaret replied. I have been sheltered too long from the ugliness men hide behind Latin names and glass bottles. She moved to the mantel where Oliver's spectacles rested. She picked them up, cradling them in both hands. For a moment, the facade of composure cracked. A single tear fell, just one, but bright as a raindrop sliding down a window pane. He trusted them, she whispered, and they killed him. Mrs. Greenfield covered her hand. What will you do now? Margaret straightened, placing the spectacles gently back upon the mantel. I will not drown myself in syrups meant to numb me. I will not hide behind curtains until the world forgets Oliver Bramcote's name. I will not allow a surgeon's ambition to bury the truth. She turned, eyes glowing with quiet flame. I will take this to Parliament if I must. Mrs. Greenfield stared. Parliament? Margaret, women don't. They will hear me, she said, one way or another. Her voice did not rise. It did not waver. It simply was steady, resolute, undeniable. Margaret crossed the room, gathered her shawl, and pinned her mourning veil with practiced precision. Where are you going? Her friend whispered. To speak with Dr. Hale, Margaret answered. We share the same enemy. She paused at the door. Men who kill with chemicals and call it medicine do not deserve the shadows they hide in. With that, she stepped out into the cold London morning. The fog swirled around her, but she did not shrink from it. She walked through it as though through smoke, untouched, unwavering. A widow, yes, but a woman who refused to fade and who was ready to make the city listen. Inspector Reginald Ashcombe was a peculiar man by London standards, too honest for politics, too stubborn for comfort, and entirely too observant for the liking of those who preferred their deeds tucked safely beneath shadows. He moved through the fog like a blade carved from granite, shoulders broad beneath a worn overcoat, boots striking the cobblestones with steady purpose. His colleagues joked that Ashcombe could smell a lie the way a hound smelled blood. They were not wrong. That morning, as he stepped into the Metropolitan Police office on Cannon Street, whispers rustled through the corridors like dry leaves. Another case at Kensworth. The chemist, still missing. And the widow, have you heard what she's doing? Ashcombe ignored them. He merely removed his gloves, hung his hat on a brass hook, and made his way to his desk, where a sealed envelope waited, stamped with the crest of the medical board. He slit it open with a practiced motion. Inside was a request, no, a directive. Investigate the rising concerns around anesthetic misuse in London's hospitals, beginning with the death of one Oliver Bramcote. Attached were two names written in a hurried scrawl. Dr. Jonathan Hale, Mr. Tobias Greeley. Ashcombe's brow furrowed. He knew Hale, a serious, principled physician who'd served as an expert witness in earlier court cases. Greeley he knew only through city chatter. a timid apothecary, overworked and underappreciated. Then, tucked behind the documents, he found something curious. A single sheet, handwritten, beautiful penmanship, a widow's script. Inspector Ashcombe, my husband was not the first. He will not be the last. I beg you find the truth. Margaret Bramcote. Ashcombe folded the note slowly, sliding it into his pocket. Grief sharpened people in different ways. Some collapsed inward, others disappeared into bottles, and some rare ones stood so firmly in their sorrow that the world itself had to shift around them. He admired such people. The door to his office creaked open. Superintendent Clark stepped in, clearing his throat with exaggerated formality. Ashcombe, he began, eyes drifting to the papers. That case, I'd advise leaving it be. Ashcombe looked up, expression cool. Leaving it be? Yes, Clark said with forced calm. The death was unfortunate, but the medical community insists there was no wrongdoing. Best not rattle their cages. Hospitals bring prestige, funding, influential men. Influential men, Ashcombe repeated, voice flat. Or dangerous ones. Clark stiffened. Don't twist my words. Ashcombe rose to full height, tall, imposing, unblinking. I will follow the truth where it leads. If that rattles cages, so be it. Clark's jaw tightened. You risk your position. Ashcombe tilted his head slightly. Then, they'll have to find another inspector willing to look the other way. Silence stretched. Then Clark left with a muttered curse. By late afternoon, Ashcombe was on Fosterwick Lane, standing inside Pruitt's ransacked laboratory. Constable Merrick briefed him nervously. Disappeared in the night, books taken, door broken, no witnesses. Ashcombe examined the scene with clinical precision. His gaze lingered on the overturned stool, the broken drawer, the faint smear of dried blood. Professional, Ashcombe murmured. Someone who knew what they were looking for. Merrick shifted. What now, sir? Ashcombe turned sharply. Now? We find the man who tried to speak before someone makes certain he never speaks again. He left the shop and strode into the fog-bound street, where lamplighters were raising their poles to ignite the early evening lamps. The city glowed dimly, its edges blurred by mist. He adjusted his coat, scanning the street as though expecting danger to materialize from the shadows, because he knew it already had. A carriage turned the corner. A man stepped out, glancing in Ashcombe's direction before disappearing into the alley. Something in the man's gait, a practiced casualness, pricked the inspector's instincts. He followed. The fog swallowed him but did not deter him. Each step echoed with certainty. He was not a man who bent to pressure, not a man who accepted silence, not a man who could be bought, bribed, or frightened into blindness. Inspector Reginald Ashcombe hunted truth like a man with nothing left to lose. And London, wrapped in chemical fog and whispered secrets, did not yet realize one very dangerous fact. Someone was finally coming for the truth. The chimneys of Hargrove and Sons chemical works loomed above the East End, like jagged sentinels, black smoke curling into the grey dawn as if the sky itself were bleeding. The streets around the factory were slick with coal dust and rainwater, reflecting the dim lamplight in puddles that shivered under the tread of boots. For most Londoners, the factory was a place of necessity, a source of employment, of industrial miracle, of progress measured in vats and gears. For Dr. Jonathan Hale, and for those few who understood its darker significance, it was a crucible of danger. Inside the factory, the scent of progress mingled with the scent of ruin. Ether rose in invisible columns from open vats, curling toward the low rafters. Chloroform simmered gently in smaller basins, its vapor pressing softly against the lungs, sweet and sharp, hypnotic in its quiet insistence. Morphine tinctures, refined and potent, glimmered in half-filled barrels, stacked meticulously, yet always in a state of quiet chaos. The workers moved among them with mechanical precision, faces pale beneath soot and fatigue, unaware that each inhaled breath carried them closer to a fog that dulled not just the senses, but the mind. Hale entered through the side gate, his coat pressed tight against the chill. He had visited factories before, for inspections, for medical emergencies, for the occasional consultation. But he had never seen a place so saturated with chemicals, so densely alive with the scent of substances capable of both salvation and death. A foreman noticed him immediately. "Dr. Hale," he called, voice echoing against brick walls. "What brings you here at this hour?" "Observation," Hale replied evenly, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his apprehension. "I need to understand the processes in full, what enters these bottles and what leaves them." The foreman nodded, guiding Hale along the narrow catwalks between vats and barrels. Ether vapor clung to Hale's coat almost instantly, brushing against his throat with a seductive sweetness. He fought it down. Each inhalation threatened to blur the line between alert and drift, between scrutiny and surrender. Below them, a worker stirred a vat of chloroform with a long wooden paddle. He hummed softly, a tune lifted from a song he had forgotten the words to, utterly unaware that the vapor curling around him dulled his mind more surely than the mortar beneath his feet dulled his arms. Hale watched him closely, heart tightening. One misstep, one fainting, one accidental spill, and the results could be catastrophic. The foreman led Hale to a smaller chamber, where vats of a new mixture simmered under careful heat. The formula had been requested by Kensworth Hospital, apparently for use in experimental anesthesia. Hale's stomach twisted as he read the faint label. Somnus, number 3. The same preparation that had claimed Oliver Bramcote's life. The same mixture that had sent Thomas Hale's small body to the edge of oblivion. The same mixture that had been supplied in secret, ordered in quantities far exceeding safety. He moved closer, studying the workers' hands, their posture, their indifference. It was not ignorance, not entirely. It was a kind of learned blindness. A city's need for medicine, for speed, for efficiency, had trained them to ignore the quiet menace in the air. Hale's own breath caught, the sweetness of ether teasing the edges of consciousness. He coughed softly, pressing a hand to his throat. "How long has this been simmering?" he asked the foreman, voice low. "Weeks," the man admitted. "Orders from London, new formulas daily. We mix, we bottle, we send. Nothing else matters." Hale exhaled slowly. He could feel the weight pressing against his chest, the burden of knowledge, of witnessing, of understanding too much. Each step through the vats, each glance at the barrels, made him shiver with a deep, uncanny awareness. The city itself was complicit. The workers, the hospitals, the chemists, they were building a network of dependence, a factory of fragrant deaths. And it was only a matter of time before more lives would drift quietly into the fog, unnoticed until the consequences were impossible to ignore. He paused, inhaling carefully. The scent of chemicals, sweet, sharp, dangerous, wrapped around him. He straightened his coat, lifting his gaze to the darkened rafters above. Somewhere in that haze, London waited, unaware of the peril growing in its own streets. And Hale knew, with chilling certainty, that unless something was done, the factory would continue producing its quiet, invisible casualties, and he would bear witness to everyone. Dr. Malcolm Beckett's townhouse on Gainsborough Street had the outward appearance of perfect order, shiny brass doorknobs, lace curtains undisturbed by the wind, polished floorboards that gleamed even in the thin light of early morning. Neighbors passing by on the cobblestones saw only a respectable man, hair neatly parted, coat pressed, gloves immaculate. They would never have guessed that within the walls a different man existed, a man leading two lives simultaneously, one measured in appearances, the other measured in chemical intoxication. Beckett rose from his feather bed long before dawn. The lamp on his nightstand had burned low overnight. its glass smudged with soot. The air in the room smelled faintly of lavender and dust, but beneath it lingered a sharper scent ether, faint but insistent, clinging to the ceiling and the folds of his blanket. Beckett inhaled it, letting the familiar sweetness coil around his chest, dulling the pulse of dread that had begun to thrum there. He dressed slowly, carefully, selecting gloves and coat as if each item were a mask. And in a sense, it was. By day, he would stride through hospitals, surgical theatres, and medical societies with the impeccable poise expected of a man of his station. By night, when the lamps dimmed and the fog crept through the streets, he became another creature entirely, drifting on the very substances he administered to others, intoxicated by the same ether and chloroform that had ensnared so many patients under his own care. Beckett's breakfast was minimal, taken in silence. He poured a small dose of a tonic into a silver cup laudanum, disguised as a restorative, and swallowed it without hesitation. The liquid burned faintly at first, then settled into warmth, silencing nerves he no longer wished to acknowledge. The morning brought no words, only the hum of the city pressing against the windows, muffled and distant, while the chemicals pressed inward, a quiet reassurance. By 8 o'clock, he had crossed the street to Kensworth Hospital. Nurses and apprentices greeted him with practiced respect. Patients waited in their beds, some quiet from fear, some quiet from the chemical fog that had already begun to settle through the wards. Beckett moved among them with confidence, administering ether and chloroform with hands both precise and habitual, his voice calm, his words measured. No one knew the truth behind the eyes that flickered beneath his well-trimmed lashes. No one suspected that the man who guided the scalpel, who reassured mothers and whispered to children, spent his nights walking the same halls alone, testing mixtures on himself, calculating dosages with obsessive care, feeling both the thrill and the dread of each inhalation. He paused briefly at the bedside of a patient recovering from abdominal surgery. The man's pulse was uneven, his breathing shallow. Beckett adjusted the cloth over his mouth, releasing a faint mist of ether. The patient drifted immediately into quiet sleep, relief written in slack features. Beckett watched for a moment, eyes narrowing, lips tightening. Satisfaction and a faint, gnawing guilt pulsed through him. The day pressed forward, routine punctuated by procedures, consultations, and careful observations. And throughout it all, Beckett's mind carried a secret rhythm, a counterpoint to the work expected of him. The memory of last night's experiment, the taste of the tonic on his tongue, the sensation of floating above his own thoughts as he inhaled ether from a small silver cup in the quiet of his laboratory. By the time evening arrived, the city had darkened into fog and the hospital had grown silent. Beckett returned to his townhouse, removing gloves, coat, and mask-like demeanor in one fluid motion. He moved to the hidden cabinet, selecting a vial of chloroform. A single drop, inhaled carefully, would dissolve the weight of the day, blur his conscience, and allow him to drift into a self-imposed oblivion. In that dim room, shadows stretching across the walls, Beckett drank in the scent, felt the pulse of chemicals threading through him. The man who saved lives during the day became the man who surrendered to them at night. One life split in two, each portion indistinguishable from the other, bound by the same volatile substances that both healed and destroyed. And as the candle flickered low, Beckett understood the truth. He was no longer merely a physician. He was both architect and prisoner of a quiet empire of chemicals, a ruler over life and death, and a man gradually losing the line between the two. The city slept outside, oblivious. Within, the fog rose, unchallenged, as it always had. The Men's Gentlemen's Club on Arlington Street was a sanctuary of decorum, or at least of appearance. Gas lamps illuminated polished walnut, brass fixtures gleaming faintly in the low light. while the rich scent of pipe tobacco mingled with leather-bound books and faint traces of perfume brought in by visiting wives or daughters. The members, men of rank, position, and influence, moved with careful politeness, words clipped, hands steady, eyes sharp. Yet, beneath the veneer of order, a quiet revolution was underway, a slow intoxication welcomed with gleaming smiles and subtle nods. It began with the tonic wine. Served in crystal decanters at each table, its amber liquid shimmered like trapped sunlight. The bottles were imported, promised to invigorate the spirit, sharpen the mind, and strengthen the body. Advertisements proclaimed it harmless, even beneficial, fashionable, a touch of the continental for London's discerning men. But those who imbibed it slowly began to understand the truth. It carried subtle opiates, a delicate thread of cocaine extract, and a whisper of something darker. Strength in the hands of a man who believed himself in control, yet a quiet submission to chemical influence. Lord Pembroke raised his glass in a toast to the Speaker at the head of the table, the Member of Parliament discussing fiscal reforms and colonial initiatives. He sipped. The warmth spread slowly, seductively, easing the tension in his shoulders. His mind sharpened briefly, like the edge of a knife polished in candlelight. But then a soft haze began to creep into his vision, turning corners of the room slightly blurred, figures slightly distant. "Capital ideas," he murmured to his neighbour, a barrister with a thin moustache and eyes that betrayed a touch too much curiosity for his own good. "Yes," the barrister replied, tone tight. "The wine makes everything agreeable." Above them, the chandeliers flickered gently as a draught moved through the room, carrying the faint scent of the wine to those seated at the back. Gentlemen swiveled their heads, almost imperceptibly, inhaling the sweetness as if it were part of the club's decorum. Conversation hummed softly, laughter punctuated with coughs, the occasional clearing of a throat. But beneath the polite tones, an undercurrent of chemical influence rippled, a binding agent as real as the oak walls. Dr. Jonathan Hale, seated near the library corner under the guise of a visiting colleague, observed in silence. His glass of tonic remained untouched. He noted the slight flush on the cheeks of the men, the subtle tremor in one barrister's hand as he gestured emphatically during a debate about trade laws, the glassy eyes of a retired colonel as he leaned back in his chair. Each man appeared in control, yet Hale knew the truth. The wine had claimed them, as it had countless others across London. A quiet surrender, polished and civilized, but no less dangerous for its social grace. He watched as Lord Pembroke set his glass down, pale now, fingers slightly loose around the crystal stem. Hale rose silently, slipping toward the door, careful not to draw attention. He had observed enough. A single evening's demonstration of tonic wine's power was all he needed to comprehend the subtle epidemic. Outside, the fog pressed against the club's windows like a patient waiting for confession. Inside, the gentlemen were laughing at a story told too well, oblivious to the effect running through their veins, unaware that they were slowly drifting toward the same chemical dependence that had claimed children, mothers, widows, and patients alike. Tonic wine was elegance bottled a sweet, invisible leash. Hale stepped into the fog, letting it curl around his coat and hair. He had seen the city's secret, and he knew, with the weight pressing against his chest, that society's most respected men were as bound as the children in the tenements, as vulnerable as the widows, as trapped as the patients in hospitals. London was intoxicated, not merely by spirits, but by an illusion of safety, control, and civility. And it would take more than whispers, reports, or notes from concerned physicians to awaken it from its chemical dream. The servants' quarters at St. Brackwell's Hospital were narrow, poorly lit, and perpetually cold, as though the building itself had forgotten them. Damp fog crept through the cracks of the window panes, curling around the worn floorboards, settling into the cracks between walls and ceiling. The faint scent of disinfectant lingered, but it was overpowered by something subtler, sweeter, and infinitely more insidious: ether. The chemical drifted through the corridors like an invisible patron, touching everything it encountered. Some inhaled it unknowingly, some carried it like a cloak. Martha Wells, the dresser assigned to Ward D, had been at the hospital for nearly 6 years. She was efficient, meticulous, and discreet to a fault. She had arranged bedding, cleaned surgical instruments, and tended to patients with hands that were both gentle and precise. She had seen pain, she had seen fear, and she had seen death. But nothing had prepared her for what lingered in the air after the new methods began. That morning, she awoke with the faint metallic sweetness still clinging to her hair, her sleeves, even beneath her apron, though she had washed them twice in scalding water. It was impossible to wash the ether off completely. It seeped into the skin, settled in her lungs, and curled around her thoughts. She coughed softly, pressing a hand to her chest, trying to shake the sensation. The chemical lingered like a shadow she could not outrun. By the time she arrived at the hospital, the wards were already in motion. Patients stirred beneath sheets, nurses whispered in corners, and surgeons moved with mechanical precision, faces masked but eyes bright with intent. Martha went about her work, setting trays, adjusting linens, replacing bandages. Yet with every motion, the smell clung more tightly. She could not escape it, could not cleanse herself of it, and the dread that accompanied it pressed heavier with every passing minute. She paused at a bed where a small child lay, cheeks flushed with fever. The boy's eyes flickered open, glassy and unfocused. Martha smoothed the blankets over him, inhaling the faint scent of laudanum from the syrup that had been administered. His breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible. The chemical had silenced his cries, but it could not silence the risk. Martha moved quickly, attending to the next patient, yet the air around her seemed to thicken with every breath. Ether, chloroform, morphine, they clung to her like invisible chains. She pressed her palm to her forehead, trying to steady her shaking hands. Her mind, usually sharp and disciplined, felt dulled, fogged, as though the chemicals were leaching into her very consciousness. A voice whispered behind her, faint but insistent. Dr. Beckett's instructions, the assistant surgeon's hurried corrections, the nurse's quiet fears, all blended into a chorus she could not ignore. She realized then, with a chill that prickled her skin, that no matter how carefully she moved, how scrupulously she cleaned herself, the hospital and the chemicals it revered would not release her. She had carried the scent home for months, drifting into her sleep like an uninvited companion. Even in moments of respite, the chemical's ghost lingered, a reminder of the power wielded over life and consciousness in these halls. Martha's gaze fell upon the surgical instruments she had polished and laid out earlier. Each one gleamed in the dim morning light, innocent and deadly, all at once. She shivered. Every tool, every vial, every whispered order was part of a system that had entrapped her as thoroughly as the patients themselves. The dresser could scrub, wash, and fold, but she could not wash away the invisible residue of the city's addiction to ease, its craving for control, its submission to chemicals that promised comfort and delivered dependence. She exhaled, steadying herself. She would continue her work, tend the patients, obey the surgeons, and follow the rituals expected of her. But the knowledge remained. The hospital was not a sanctuary. It was a place of subtle imprisonment, and she, the dresser who could not wash it off, was bound to it as surely as any patient beneath the sheets. The fog pressed against the windows, the ether lingered, and Martha Wells went on with her duties, carrying the invisible weight of the hospital's quiet empire of chemical dominion. The dawn broke thin and pale over Linton Street, pressing weakly through the narrow windows of the tenement houses. It was a damp, grey morning, the kind that made woolen shawls feel insufficient and coal fires barely adequate. In one small flat on the second floor, a young mother, Mrs. Clara Whitby, rocked her infant in a chair by the window. The child's cheeks were flushed with fever, tiny hands curling and uncurling as he coughed softly, a wet, rattling sound that made Clara's chest ache with helplessness. She had administered the soothing drops again, just a few, as prescribed by the chemist down the street, a pale glass vial marked with a label so generic it promised safety. Mother's restorative. She knew better, yet hope outweighed fear. She needed the baby to rest, needed herself to survive the exhaustion pressing upon her. And the baby needed quiet, a brief reprieve from the relentless cough, from the scraping, rasping sound that had haunted her every waking hour. Minutes after the drops, the child's small body relaxed, his breath evened, his eyelids fluttered, and for a fleeting moment the fever seemed to retreat. Clara's lips parted in relief. He slept, quiet, peaceful, and yet, in that very quiet, a seed of unease took root. It had not been just Clara's child. She had heard whispers, soft, uneasy, passed from neighbor to neighbor about other families, other infants, who had succumbed to the same soothing care. Mothers whispered of tiny bodies lying still for hours, eyes half closed, faces serene. Grandmothers muttered in hushed tones that perhaps some children were too fragile for even kindness. The chemist, Mr. Greeley, assured her it was perfectly safe, perfectly measured, and yet the city murmured otherwise. Hale had warned her once, in his quiet, firm way, that chemicals designed to comfort could also silence, not just cries, but life itself. Clara had nodded, but desperation, like fog, pressed in and obscured understanding. Now, as the infant slept peacefully against her shoulder, Clara felt the chill of realization creep through her chest. The very drops that had calmed her baby could have suffocated him, and if she had dosed too liberally, or if the preparation had been stronger than advertised, she could have been standing beside a silent tragedy instead of a sleeping child. The door creaked. Clara glanced up to see her neighbor, Mrs. Dunlop, peering in, concern written across her face. "They say there have been several incidents," Mrs. Dunlop whispered, glancing at the sleeping child. "Children gone in the night after taking the so-called remedies, some even in families of the well-to-do." Clara's grip on her infant tightened instinctively. I only gave him what the chemist prescribed," she stammered. "I followed instructions." Mrs. Dunlop shook her head. "Instructions mean little when the substance itself is unpredictable. Too strong, too potent, or even poorly mixed and, well, you know." Clara knew. The stories had reached her ears like distant cries through the fog. Infants, widows' children, babies in private homes, silenced not by illness but by the very comforts designed to soothe them. Families were quiet, ashamed, or fearful of speaking. Chemists claimed innocence. Doctors nodded in polite approval. And the city, unthinking and eager for modern remedies, continued to hand the tiny vials over to desperate mothers. She rocked her child gently, watching the faint rise and fall of his chest, acutely aware of how fragile it was. Every breath was a gift, every flutter of an eyelid a fragile tether to the world. And as the fog pressed against the windows, mixing with the faint scent of soot and coal from below, Clara made a vow she had never made before. She would not give another drop without understanding it fully. She would not trust appearances or advertisements or assurances from well-meaning men in glass-fronted shops. The infant's life, small and delicate, demanded vigilance. In that quiet flat on Linton Street, surrounded by the faint glow of dawn and the oppressive fog that pressed beyond the panes, the infant-soothing scandal became more than rumor. It became a lesson, written in trembling hands, shallow breaths, and the stillness that could so easily turn final. The child slept. Clara watched, silent, determined, aware that in London's chemical haze, even a mother's vigilance was a rare and precious shield. The morning air at St. Brackwell's Hospital had never felt so light. For the first time in weeks, it carried no scent of ether, no faintly sweet trace of chloroform, no ghost of morphine lingering in the corners of the wards. It was a clean, sharp day. The fog lifted just enough to catch the weak sunlight streaking through the high windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spectres in the beams. The nurses paused as they moved through the corridors, breathing more freely, their steps lighter. For the first time, the hospital seemed to exhale. Dr. Jonathan Hale walked through the central ward with deliberate pace, noting the change with quiet satisfaction. The rows of iron beds, once shrouded in the haze of chemicals, now revealed themselves fully. Patients stirred, some coughing softly, some opening their eyes to the brightness of the morning, the natural light no longer diffused by the invisible fog of anesthetics. Their faces, previously slack and dulled by soporific substances, now held color, awareness, and most importantly, the spark of vitality. He paused at a small bed near the corner where little Thomas Hale lay, his small chest rising steadily, eyes bright with the clarity of unencumbered breath. The boy smiled faintly upon noticing the doctor, a gesture so ordinary, yet so extraordinary after weeks of chemical sedation. Hale knelt beside him, brushing back fine strands of hair from his forehead. "Feeling better today, Thomas?" he asked, voice soft. Thomas nodded vigorously, the faintest laugh escaping him. It was a fragile, imperfect sound, but it carried the weight of survival, of life reclaimed from the edge of chemical oblivion. Hale smiled, a rare warmth breaking through the tension that had long shadowed his shoulders. The ward itself seemed transformed. Where shadows had once clung thickly to the corners of each room, they now receded into the walls. Nurses moved swiftly, more confident in their observations, speaking in tones that carried authority without fear. There were no longer hesitations, no glances over shoulders, no subconscious tensing against the invisible presence of vapor. Even the air felt lighter, freed from the chemical oppression that had once made every step, every motion, laden with unseen weight. Hale continued down the corridor, inspecting each bed. Where once the patients had lain under the influence of soporific mixtures, they now moved independently, some sitting up, some attempting to speak, all reclaiming pieces of autonomy stolen in the fog of anesthesia. He observed with both relief and lingering unease that the immediate danger had been removed. Unease because he knew the city had yet to reckon with how easily such control had been wielded. Nurse Winfield approached him quietly, her face flushed with the exertion of monitoring patients throughout the night. "The vapors are gone," she said simply, though her voice held the disbelief and cautious hope of one who had endured too long. I never thought we'd see this." Hale nodded. "Nor I," he admitted. "But it is not enough merely to remove the chemicals. We must ensure the protocols, the oversight, and the accountability are established, so the ward remains free of this fog." He moved toward the storeroom, where the remaining vials of ether, chloroform, and morphine were carefully catalogued, sealed, and placed under strict supervision. Each bottle bore the weight of the hospital's past transgressions, reminders of the patients who had nearly been lost, of families terrified by the quiet power of chemical obedience. Outside, the city began to hum with the ordinary noise of life. Carriages rattling across cobblestones, market vendors calling to each other, footsteps echoing along the streets. For a moment, the hospital was no longer a prison of vapors and quiet terror. It was a place of healing again, its wards free to hold the sound of ordinary breathing, ordinary life. Hale paused at the doorway to the central ward, looking down the rows of beds, the nurses attending, the patients stirring. A sense of fragile victory pressed against him, tempered by the knowledge that vigilance must remain. The fog had lifted, but the lessons of its presence could not be ignored. In that ward without vapours, London had glimpsed the possibility of clarity, of life uninterrupted by invisible chains. And Dr. Jonathan Hale understood this fragile peace must be guarded as fiercely as the lives it now allowed to breathe freely. The townhouse on Gainsborough Row had grown colder than usual that evening, despite the coal fire burning in the hearth. The fog pressed against the windows, thick and insistent, turning the gaslight outside into a pale, trembling glow that filtered through the drawn curtains. Inside, the house felt smaller, more intimate, suffused with the scent of candle wax, old paper, and something faintly acrid, the residual echo of chemicals that had lingered in the household long before the present evening. Margaret Bramcote moved quietly through the parlour, her skirts rustling softly against the polished wooden floor. Her hands, pale and slender, were folded around a small ledger she had retrieved from Mr. Greeley's apothecary weeks earlier. The book contained names, quantities, and delivery dates, each entry a record of medicines that had both soothed and imperiled the citizens of London. She had memorized every line, every margin note, and the weight of the knowledge pressed down upon her chest like a vice. Her daughter, Eliza, sat at the piano, fingers poised over the keys, though she did not play. She had learned the art of silence from her mother, a careful mimicry of restraint in a household that had demanded vigilance above all else. The girl's wide eyes followed every movement, tracking Margaret's steps as though she were reading not merely the ledger, but the pulse of her mother's resolve. Margaret paused before the mantelpiece, where Oliver's spectacles rested beside a half-folded newspaper. She brushed her fingers across the frame, feeling the chill of glass against her palm. A shiver ran through her body, not from cold, but from the memory of her husband's last days, the smooth, calculated administration of anesthetics that had silenced him too thoroughly, the gentle assurance of surgeons who treated life and death with the same detached precision. Her breath caught as she glanced toward the front window. The gas lamps outside flickered, pale halos in the fog, and for a moment she imagined them as eyes, watching, judging, recording her next move. She set the ledger on the table and drew the curtains just a fraction tighter, cocooning the room in dimness and privacy. The world beyond might whisper, might observe, but within, the matters of truth and accountability rested solely in her hands. Margaret settled into a chair beside the ledger, opening it to the page she had been studying most frequently, the record of Somnus. Number 3, the anesthetic that had claimed her husband. Her fingers traced the inked numbers, and she felt the chill of inevitability. This chemical, devised in secrecy and delivered with quiet urgency, had been entrusted to men who believed themselves above consequence. And yet, here it lay documented, exposed for her understanding and for the reckoning that might yet come. A soft knock echoed through the townhouse. Margaret did not start. The sound was faint, tentative, but deliberate, almost rhythmic. Eliza stirred, glancing toward the door. Margaret rose, moving with deliberate grace to answer. It was Dr. Jonathan Hale, standing in the dim light of the hall, coat damp from fog and boots muddied with the streets he had traversed to reach her. "Margaret," he said softly, bowing his head slightly, "I have come to see the ledger." Margaret's expression was unreadable, a careful mask cultivated over weeks of vigilance. "Dr. Hale," she replied, voice measured. "Come in. There are truths that must be confronted in the safety of this room." He entered, his gaze following the drawn curtains, the polished floors, and finally resting on the ledger she had placed at the center of the parlor table. The two of them stood in silence, the weight of their shared knowledge pressing between them. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, wrapping the townhouse in quiet secrecy. Margaret sat, opening the ledger deliberately. "Here lies the record," she said. "Names, dates, deliveries, quantities of chemicals that have sedated, numbed, and in some cases, destroyed lives. Her voice trembled faintly, though her hands did not. "We must decide how to act and whom to hold accountable." Hale nodded, moving to her side. "And we must ensure the city cannot claim ignorance." Together, they leaned over the ledger, poring over its contents, the gaslight flickering against the pages. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the street. Inside, the truth, long hidden, began to take shape. In the townhouse with the drawn curtains, grief, vigilance, and determination coalesced into a single, fragile resolution: to confront the shadows that had long governed the lives of the innocent, and to illuminate the dark corridors of London's chemical empire. The theatre at Kensworth Hospital was unusually silent that evening, the usual hum of anticipation muted beneath the weight of a collective unease. The lamps cast a trembling glow across polished iron tables and neatly arranged instruments, but tonight their light seemed diffused, as if uncertain. A faint odour lingered in the air: disinfectant, burned matches, and something subtler, sweeter, sharper: ether, a ghost of its own past. Dr. Malcolm Beckett stood at the head of the table, preparing for a routine operation, yet his movements were uncharacteristically slow. The scalpel felt heavier in his hand than usual. His gloves were damp with perspiration, despite the coolness of the theatre, and his fingers trembled, almost imperceptibly, as he arranged the instruments. He had performed countless operations, guided hands with precision, and administered anesthetics with a confidence born of long practice. But tonight, each vial, each instrument, each measured breath of ether seemed to mock him. The very substances he had mastered threatened to betray him. His pulse thrummed in his ears, irregular and loud, a drumbeat against the silence of the theatre. Nurse Winfield noticed immediately. She had worked with Beckett long enough to detect when something was amiss. "Doctor?" she asked softly, approaching his side, careful not to draw attention. "Are you well?" Beckett forced a smile, thin and brittle. "I am entirely composed," he said, though the words carried none of their usual authority. His hand shook slightly as he reached for the first instrument. The patient lay on the table, pale but conscious, eyes wide and alert beneath the sterile drapes. A simple procedure, nothing complex, yet the surgeon's unsteadiness threatened to overshadow even the straightforward nature of the operation. Beckett took a deep breath, but the faint scent of ether, clinging to his coat from previous cases, pressed against him. It whispered, reminding him of all the nights he had experimented in secret, inhaling just enough to steady his own mind while ignoring the dangers. He looked down at his hands again. The tremor was undeniable now, a subtle quiver that threatened precision. Instruments gleamed under gaslight, poised for use. And yet, the surgeon realized with a sinking certainty that the hands meant to heal were no longer entirely his own. "You will be fine," Winfield murmured, standing just behind him, her gaze steady, unflinching. "Take a moment." Beckett nodded stiffly, forcing his breathing into slow, deliberate rhythm. Each inhale brought with it the faint chemical haze still clinging to him, and he fought the lulling effect it carried. He had trained himself for years to wield chemicals for others, but now he needed to wield them against himself, against panic, against fatigue, against the creeping fear that he might falter in the theatre where lives depended on his control. He flexed his fingers, focusing on their movement, the tactile sensation of leather gloves against skin, the subtle friction of the scalpel between thumb and forefinger. Slowly, deliberately, the trembling eased, though not entirely. The threat remained a reminder of all that could go wrong, all the lives that hung in precarious balance. The patient's breathing was shallow, steadying under the careful administration of anesthesia. Beckett's hands hovered above the surgical site, fingers coiled with awareness, aware that one slip could undo the fragile order he had cultivated. A bead of sweat traced a line along his temple. He wiped it away, forcing focus, summoning control over hands that had betrayed him with the weight of secrecy and chemical dependence. Outside the theatre, the fog pressed against the hospital windows, thick and unrelenting. Inside, every subtle motion mattered. The scalpel's edge, the ether-laden air, the trembling fingertips, they all demanded vigilance. Beckett exhaled, centering himself. For the first time in weeks, he realized that mastery required not only knowledge, but humility. That even a surgeon accustomed to power must reckon with the substances he commanded, the lives he oversaw, and the shadows of the city that pressed against every decision. Tonight, the surgeon's hands shook, but he held them steady enough to remember that trembling was not weakness. It was a reminder of the price of ambition, the burden of knowledge, and the fragility of life under chemical influence. And as he began the incision, the theatre held its breath with him, shadows and vapours and all. The apothecary at the corner of Pembroke Lane had always appeared orderly, almost quaint, as though it were merely a relic of a simpler age, amidst the creeping modernity of gas lamps and horse-drawn carriages. Glass jars lined every shelf, neatly labelled in careful script: camphor, laudanum, peppermint extract, tinctures of opium, and a dozen other remedies whose names promised relief. But behind the counter, in a small locked cabinet, sat vials that whispered of danger, of power, of a quiet dominion over life and consciousness. Tobias Greeley, the chemist, regarded the cabinet as both a responsibility and a burden. Its lock was iron, the key worn from years of use. Inside were the bottles no mother, no doctor, no passerby should see, the mixtures that had sedated children, calmed mothers, and, in some cases, silenced the unfortunate forever. Ether, chloroform, somnus, number 3, morphine, and other compounds blended with a precision that could comfort or destroy. Each vial contained the potential to sway life from waking to oblivion, and each demanded careful, unwavering attention. Greeley had always known that temptation accompanied his craft. The city around him, desperate and unthinking, relied on his discretion. Hospitals demanded potency, surgeons demanded results, and wealthy families demanded calm for their children and peace for their mothers. Greeley provided it. And yet, every bottle he handed over carried a shadow, a whisper of mortality hidden beneath the amber liquid. That evening, a knock came at the door. Greeley adjusted his spectacles, peering cautiously through the small glass pane. Dr. Jonathan Hale stood on the threshold, his coat pressed and damp from the fog outside. Hale's eyes were steady, yet heavy with the exhaustion of nights spent watching children, mothers, and patients drift too close to chemical oblivion. "Tobias," Hale said softly, stepping inside, "we need to talk about the cabinet." Greeley's hands twitched nervously. "Dr. Hale, you must understand. The cabinet exists for protection, not misuse." Hale moved closer, gaze drifting to the locked iron door. Protection for whom? For the city? Or for those who wield the substances within? Every vial here has been used to sedate beyond need, to quiet life beyond reason. Children, mothers, widows, men in hospitals, these bottles have claimed more than comfort. They have claimed control. Greeley swallowed, pressing his fingers to the edge of the counter. "It is not my place to question those who order the medicines. I provide as requested, and I secure the remainder. That is all I can do." "Is that all?" Hale asked sharply. "Is that enough? Do you not see that the cabinet itself has become an instrument of terror, a repository of unchecked influence? Every delivery, every mixture, every carefully measured dose carries a risk beyond what any ledger can contain." Greeley hesitated, then nodded faintly, as though conceding a truth he had long avoided acknowledging. I know, and yet it is my livelihood, my duty. Without compliance, the city would find another chemist, and worse mistakes might occur elsewhere." Hale placed a hand on the counter. eyes fixed on the rows of bottles. And yet, here it stands, a silent testament to both obedience and complicity. The city breathes in these vapors without thought, and the people you serve trust in your discretion. But trust, Tobias, is fragile. One misstep, one lapse, and the consequences are irreversible. The chemist's gaze fell to the cabinet, to the shadowed bottles within. Each gleamed faintly under the lamplight, innocent yet threatening, promising relief while harboring ruin. He felt the weight of the responsibility pressing into his chest. For years, he had believed he was merely facilitating medicine, maintaining order in a world of desperate needs. But Hale's words reminded him that facilitation could become facilitation of harm, that silence could be complicity. Outside, London pressed against the apothecary windows. The fog swirled through the streets, carrying with it the scent of coal, wet stone, and the faint, lingering aroma of chemicals that had touched too many lives. Inside, Greeley stood before his cabinet, Hale beside him, and the bottles waited silently. For the first time, the chemist understood fully. The poison cabinet was more than glass and iron. It was a ledger of choices, a chronicle of influence, and a mirror reflecting the city's quiet surrender to the power of anesthetics and sedatives. And he, its keeper, could no longer claim ignorance. The two men stood in silence, the weight of unseen consequences pressing like the fog beyond the windows. The cabinet remained locked, but the truth it contained had already begun to seep into the light. The morning at St. Brackwell's Hospital was unusually silent, yet in Ward B, a single bed betrayed a restless energy that no chemical could suppress. The patient, Mr. Alfred Morley, had undergone surgery 3 days prior, a procedure meant to be routine, made ostensibly painless by the mixture of ether and chloroform administered under Dr. Beckett's direction. But Alfred Morley remembered everything, every moment, every sensation, every slight miscalculation that had gone unnoticed by those who believed their methods infallible. He lay beneath the thin sheets, eyes wide and alert, staring into the muted light, filtering through the narrow window. The fog pressing against the glass seemed almost alive, as if it too wished to whisper the secrets of the past 3 days. Each breath he drew was measured, deliberate, an effort to maintain control over the body that had been violated by both medicine and ambition. Nurse Winfield hovered nearby, her presence both comforting and tense. She had witnessed the transformation of wards into quiet cathedrals of sedation, seen children and adults alike succumb to the chemical haze that promised rest but delivered dependence, sometimes death. And now, Alfred Morley's full consciousness brought an entirely new burden. The patient's mind had not been dulled or softened. Instead, it recorded, analyzed, and recalled every sound of the theater, the hiss of ether, the faint metallic click of surgical instruments, the whispered orders of the assistants resonated vividly within him. "Mr. Morley," Winfield murmured, voice careful, almost trembling, "you are awake. Rest now. The procedure is over." He turned his head slowly, eyes sharp. "Rest?" he repeated, the single word charged with incredulity. "Do you call that rest?" His gaze swept the room, noticing the faint scent of ether clinging to the curtains, the polished steel of instruments still arranged as they had been, as though expecting him to forget. "Do you think I have slept?" Winfield swallowed, stepping closer. "You were under anesthesia." "Anesthesia?" he interrupted, voice rising ever so slightly. "Do you know what that means? That my body was guided, manipulated, suspended in a fog I could not escape, but my mind remembered. Every detail, every sound, every touch of the scalpel. You did not anesthetize me. You transported me into a chemical theater of control." A silence followed, heavy with the weight of accusation. Nurses glanced at each other, uncertain how to respond. Dr. Beckett, summoned hastily, arrived with the precision of someone used to command but unprepared for confrontation. His face was pale, lips drawn, eyes avoiding Morley's piercing gaze. "Mr. Morley," he said carefully, attempting reassurance, "the anesthesia was administered according to standard procedures. Any discomfort you experienced was unintended. Your recovery is progressing normally." "Standard procedures?" Morley's voice cracked, though not with weakness. "Do you understand what that phrase conceals? Do you understand the terror, the awareness I had despite the drugs? I was awake. I felt everything. I remembered everything." Beckett shifted uneasily, his usual calm now tempered by unease. The assistant nurses fidgeted. Winfield pressed a hand to her forehead, exhaling slowly. She had witnessed compliance in patients before, quiet acquiescence to sedation. But this was something different. Morley's mind, intact and alert, exposed the theatre in which he had been manipulated. "Your methods were reckless," Morley continued, voice steady despite the trembling of his hands. "The mixture, the combinations of ether, chloroform, morphine, it was too potent. You treated me as an experiment and yet expected me to forget. I remember every second, every moment." The room fell silent again, heavier than the chemical haze that had filled it days before. Beckett's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth, perhaps to justify, perhaps to dismiss, but no words seemed sufficient. Hale arrived shortly thereafter, summoned by Nurse Winfield. He knelt beside Morley, eyes solemn. "I warned them," he said softly. "The chemicals may dull the body, but the mind sometimes, it sees more than we wish it could." Morley's gaze met Hale's. "I saw everything," he whispered, "and I will not forget. Not ever." Outside, the fog pressed against the hospital windows like a living thing. Inside, the ward was no longer a theatre of sedation. It was a crucible of memory, of conscience, and of accountability, illuminated by the unwavering awareness of one patient who refused to be silenced. By mid-morning, the offices of the London Chronicle were already a symphony of typewriters, ink-stained fingers, and hushed conversations carrying the scent of fresh print and damp coal smoke. Journalists moved swiftly through narrow corridors, carrying bundles of dispatches, proofs, and letters from distant correspondents. But in the midst of the ordinary chaos, one man, a young reporter named Arthur Fenwick, sat frozen at his desk, eyes fixed on the letter that had arrived just moments earlier. It bore no stamp, no return address, only the carefully penned handwriting of a widow named Margaret Bramcote. She wrote of her husband's death, the anesthetic administered during a routine operation, the mixture that had silenced him too thoroughly, and the layers of secrecy that had protected the responsible parties. The words trembled across the page with grief and determination, precise yet raw, each sentence a quiet indictment of the complacency and ambition that had allowed death to be sanitized by propriety. Fenwick read the letter 3 times before moving. The air around him seemed to thicken with anticipation, as though the newsroom itself held its breath. He looked at his colleagues, most engrossed in the daily reports of commerce, accidents, and parliamentary proceedings, unaware that a story of far greater consequence now rested in his hands. He cleared his throat and addressed the editor, Mr. Langley, whose spectacles perched precariously on the bridge of his nose. "Sir, this letter, it speaks of malpractice, chemical sedation, and deaths unreported. His words faltered under the weight of the truth they carried. It is more than scandal, it is a reckoning." Langley's eyes narrowed. "Show me." Fenwick handed over the letter. Langley read, slowly, deliberately, the words sinking into him like stones dropped into a still pond. The editor's usual composure faltered as he felt the undercurrent of urgency, of secrecy, unveiled. The city, the hospitals, the chemists, all of it, the veil had been lifted by a widow's courage. "This is extraordinary," Langley said finally, "and dangerous. Publishing it could provoke every surgeon, apothecary, and hospital administrator in London. The repercussions, I do not think they've been considered." Fenwick nodded. "Precisely why it must be printed. The public has a right to know. Mothers, children, patients, anyone who trusts their lives to these mixtures, they must be warned. Otherwise, more will suffer in silence." Langley leaned back in his chair, fingers pressed to his temples. "Extraordinary claims, though, require proof." He gestured toward the letter. "We must verify before this leaves the office." Fenwick felt a tightening in his chest. He had expected this resistance, but he had not anticipated how weighty the inertia of propriety could be. Still, the letter had already opened a door. One glimpse of the truth, and the silence that had protected the hospitals, the chemists, and the surgeons could no longer hold. He left the office immediately, making his way through the misty streets to the Bramcote townhouse. Margaret met him at the door, her expression resolute despite the shadow of grief lingering about her eyes. She led him inside to the ledger she had painstakingly kept, detailing deliveries of anesthetics, quantities, dates, and the names of those who had administered them. Fenwick traced the inked entries with his finger, feeling the weight of every bottle, every vial, every subtle deception. He glanced at Margaret, seeing in her the quiet fury that had propelled this truth from private grief into public awareness. The city had remained blind, lulled by the promise of comfort, progress, and propriety, but here it could no longer ignore what had been hidden in shadows. Back at the newspaper, Fenwick typed feverishly, words spilling onto the page with precision and intensity. He recounted the deaths, the misused chemicals, the quiet complicity of those entrusted with life. The wards, the apothecaries, the families, all were laid bare, illuminated by the unrelenting clarity of evidence and grief. When the edition went to print that evening, London woke to a headline that cut through the fog like a blade. "Deaths in the name of comfort. Chemical sedation and the widow's warning." The city exhaled. For the first time, St. Brackwell's, Kensworth Hospital, and the chemist's secret corridors were no longer hidden. The silence had been broken, and the people of London, long lulled into complacency by powders, tonics, and vapours, were forced to confront the dangerous weight of convenience. Margaret Bramcote, standing by her window, watched the fog swirl in the street. She had wielded the pen of truth as her instrument, and the city had listened. It was a fragile victory, tempered by the knowledge that reckoning was only beginning. And somewhere, in shadowed laboratories and locked surgical theatres, the men who believed themselves untouchable stirred, sensing the first tremors of the storm about to fall. The Old Bailey, imposing and austere, rose like a sentinel above the fog-enshrouded streets of London. Its stone facade, streaked with soot and rain, bore witness to centuries of human frailty, ambition, and consequence. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of polished wood, ink, and the faint, persistent aroma of coal smoke from the streets below. The benches were filled with citizens of every class, men in top hats, women in mourning attire, clerks clutching notebooks, and the curious who had come merely for spectacle, all whispered with a tension that made the walls themselves seem to quiver. At the center of the courtroom, Dr. Malcolm Beckett stood, impeccably dressed yet rigid, his hands resting on the polished surface of the witness stand. For weeks, the city had been agitated by reports of deaths in hospitals under his administration, reports that had begun with the brave intervention of Margaret Bramcote and the investigative fervor of Dr. Jonathan Hale. Now, Beckett faced the culmination of private dread and public scrutiny, a trial that would not merely judge him, but the very practices of modern medicine in London. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed barrister named Mr. Fenwick, formerly a journalist himself, paced the floor with a quiet authority. He detailed, calmly but deliberately, the the chain of events leading to the death of Oliver Bramcote, the administration of Somnus. Number 3, the dosage orders, the chemical mixtures, and the unchecked reliance on substances like chloroform and ether. His voice, measured and deliberate, carried through the hall, each word leaving a mark upon the listeners. "Ladies and gentlemen," Fenwick said, eyes sweeping over the gallery, "we are not here to condemn medicine itself. We are here to examine accountability, to consider the consequences of ambition when unchecked by conscience. The lives affected by these chemicals were ordinary, but their deaths are a warning to the city, a warning that science, without scrutiny, becomes a tool of tragedy." Beckett's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the stand. His mind traced the faces of the patients he had seen fall into chemical sleep, recalling the faint twitch of a child's fingers, the slackened jaw of a man who had not woken properly, the subtle, panicked glance of a nurse who had witnessed too much. He had justified his actions with precision, with confidence, with the belief that his skill and knowledge would protect them all. Yet now, under the weight of public scrutiny, each decision felt like a stone upon his chest. Witnesses were called nurses, apothecaries, family members, and Dr. Hale himself. Their testimonies painted a picture both vivid and damning. Ether-laden wards, silent children, widow's grief, records meticulously kept, yet revealing a pattern of dangerous reliance on chemicals. The city listened in rapt attention, gasps and murmurs spreading like ripples across the benches. In the gallery, Margaret Bramcote sat quietly, eyes fixed upon the accused. She had once been invisible in the fog of grief, now a beacon of conscience and courage. Her presence, steadfast and unyielding, reminded the court of the human stakes, a life snuffed not by accident, but by decisions made in the guise of progress and propriety. Beckett rose to speak in his defense, his voice steady yet strained. He invoked intention, expertise, and the pursuit of medical advancement. Yet every word rang hollow against the testimony, the ledger, the chemical traces, and the city's collective awareness of what had occurred. The murmurs in the courtroom were not merely of disbelief, they were of awakening. Outside, London's fog swirled around the Old Bailey like a restless spirit. Inside, the city itself seemed to pulse with attention, divided between those who revered the doctor's skill and those who demanded justice for the lives imperiled. The trial had become more than a question of culpability. It was a reckoning with the trust London placed in medicine, in chemicals, in men who wore white coats as armor. As the day drew on, the weight of anticipation pressed on every chest in the courtroom. The verdict remained uncertain, but one truth was undeniable. The city had awakened from its chemical stupor, and the silence that had protected mistakes, ambitions, and the unchecked power of anesthetics had finally been broken. Parliament sat in session beneath the gilded arches of the House of Commons, the chambers echoing with the low murmur of anticipation. Gas lamps flickered against oak panels, casting shadows that danced like restless spirits across the floor. Outside, London's fog clung to the streets, curling around the lampposts and cobblestones as though listening, as though waiting for the words within to reach the city and reshape its conscience. Inside, lawmakers shifted in their seats, papers and petitions in hand, their faces drawn with fatigue or determination, as the discussion turned to a subject that had simmered beneath the city's surface for weeks: the unchecked administration of anesthetics, tonics, and chemical remedies across hospitals and households alike. The hearing was precipitated by a series of tragic events: deaths in private homes, infants sedated beyond safety, widows who had watched their husbands fade into chemical oblivion, and the near catastrophe in hospital wards under the guidance of overconfident surgeons. All had been documented with painstaking precision by Dr. Jonathan Hale and corroborated by Margaret Bramcote, whose courage had forced the city to confront a truth long ignored. Mr. Thomas Langley, a member of the Parliamentary Committee on Health and Public Welfare, rose to address the chamber. His voice, though steady, carried the weight of urgency. Honourable members, it is evident that the use of anaesthetics, particularly ether, chloroform, and certain compounded mixtures, has exceeded the bounds of prudence. In private households, in the care of children, and in hospitals, these substances have been administered with insufficient oversight, resulting in both injury and death. The city can no longer remain passive. Langley's words echoed across the chamber. Others murmured agreement, while some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, aware that the medical community wielded considerable influence. Yet the accounts submitted, the ledgers from apothecaries, the testimonies of nurses, and the letter from Margaret Bramcote herself were impossible to dismiss. A debate followed, voices rising and falling, some invoking the sanctity of medical autonomy, others insisting that the public's trust had been violated. Dr. Hale's meticulous reports were cited repeatedly, each example of overreach and negligence presented with an air of inexorable logic. Members of Parliament scrutinised the chemical mixture's potency, the quantities supplied to hospitals and households, and the evidence of deaths that could have been prevented with proper regulation. Finally, a motion was put forth: the creation of legal safeguards governing the sale, distribution, and administration of anaesthetic compounds and potent tonics. Apothecaries would be required to maintain detailed records, physicians would face oversight and accountability, and chemical preparations deemed too dangerous for unregulated use would be strictly controlled. Those who violated these provisions would face penalties, and a registry of licensed medical practitioners and apothecaries would be established to enforce compliance. The chamber fell silent as the motion passed, the sound of the gavel reverberating through the hall like the tolling of a bell. Outside, London's streets remained shrouded in fog, but within, a quiet shift had occurred. The city, long lulled into complacency by promises of relief and comfort, now had a framework to protect its most vulnerable citizens: children, widows, the sick, and the infirm. Dr. Hale, present in the gallery, felt the tension in his chest ease for the first time in weeks. Margaret Bramcote, seated beside him, allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible sigh. The Apothecary Act, as it would come to be called, was a first step, a legal acknowledgement that chemicals, while miraculous in intent, demanded respect, oversight, and accountability. Yet even as Parliament adjourned and the fog pressed against the windows outside, Hale knew that the law alone could not erase the memories of those lost, nor could it cleanse the wards and households already tainted by misuse. The city had awakened to the dangers that lurked in vials and flasks, but vigilance would be required to ensure that the Apothecary Act was more than words written on paper. In the quiet streets of London, the lamps burned low, illuminating faces and corners alike. The city had taken its first breath after a long chemical slumber, and though the fog still clung stubbornly to its edges, there was a sense, faint, fragile, and precious, that a measure of justice had been restored. The apothecary shop on Fosterwick Lane was silent, as though the city itself had stepped softly inside and held its breath. Dust motes floated lazily in the early morning light, visible only where the sun pierced the fog-thick windows. Shelves, once crowded with the gleaming vials and decanters of potent tonics, narcotics, and anesthetics, now bore a careful emptiness. One shelf remained intact, the final row of bottles that had survived the upheaval of inquiry, scandal, and regulation. On it rested a single vial, modest in size, amber-hued, its label faded and curling at the edges. Tobias Greeley approached it with measured reverence, fingers hovering above the glass, as though it contained not medicine, but memory itself. This was the last bottle, the culmination of years of silent complicity, careful deliveries, and whispered assurances to families, surgeons, and society alike. It had borne witness to hundreds of interactions, the mothers desperate to quiet their crying children, the widows seeking relief from grief, the patients lulled into chemical fogs, and the surgeons and physicians who wielded it with a mixture of ambition and hubris. Greeley's hand trembled as he touched the bottle. He felt the weight of the ledger he had kept for years, the meticulous record of every vial sold, every mixture supplied, every delivery documented in careful script. That ledger had been subpoenaed, examined, and cited in Parliament. Its contents had shaken the foundations of trust between chemist and citizen, between healer and patient. The last bottle was all that remained unexamined, all that remained untouched. He lifted it to the light. The amber liquid shimmered faintly, catching the early sunlight in a way that made it appear almost alive. The scent rose gently sweet, sharp, impossible to ignore. For a moment, Greeley inhaled it, allowing the memory of every night spent preparing, measuring, and hiding to wash over him. It was intoxicating and terrifying, a reminder of power held, responsibility ignored, and lives imperiled. The door to the shop creaked behind him. Dr. Jonathan Hale entered quietly, his coat damp from the London fog, eyes steady and solemn. He approached Greeley, observing the chemist's careful handling of the last bottle. "Tobias," Hale said softly, voice steady but heavy with consequence. "This is it, the last of them." Greeley nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yes, one remaining, one that has carried more weight than any of us could have anticipated." Hale leaned closer, studying the vial. "It is more than a bottle. It is a symbol the choices made in its use, the trust placed in hands both careful and reckless, the lives shaped, altered, or ended by what it contained." The chemist swallowed, a dry, hollow sound. "I understand. I have kept it all these years, hoping that discretion would suffice, that obedience to orders would shield me from consequence." "And yet," Hale replied, "consequence has come, laws have been passed, hospitals scrutinized, families empowered. The city has begun to awaken from its chemical haze." Greeley set the vial down slowly, reverently. "Then perhaps it is time," he murmured, "for this last one to be accounted for, to no longer hide in silence." Hale nodded. "It must be examined, recorded, its purpose, potency, and history made known. Only then can the shadow it represents truly be dispelled." Together, they lifted the vial, careful not to spill a single drop, and carried it to the counter, where the ledger lay open. Greeley traced the label with a trembling finger, while Hale recorded every detail in his own hand, ensuring that the last thread of concealment was replaced with transparency. Outside, the fog swirled around the narrow street, curling against windows and lampposts. The city was still, watching, listening, unaware of the final act being performed in the quiet apothecary. Within, the last bottle on the shelf was finally brought into the light, not merely as a vial of chemical substance, but as a testament to accountability, vigilance, and the painstaking journey from silence to truth. And in that quiet shop, amid dust motes and amber glass, London's chemical fog began to lift, one final vial at a time. The morning sun struggled through the tall, narrow windows of St. Brackwell's Hospital, glancing off the iron bed frames and polished brass fixtures, cutting through the lingering haze of the previous weeks. Yet today, the haze was absent. There were no faint whiffs of ether or chloroform, no sweet chemical tang clinging to linens or instruments, no residual warmth of morphine that had once made the wards feel like suspended time. The air, crisp and untainted, carried instead the faint scent of linseed oil and warm dust, reminders of a building, slowly returning to the natural rhythms of life. Dr. Jonathan Hale walked the central corridor with measured steps, noting the change. The ward, which had for so long resembled a cathedral of quiet sedation, now seemed alive. Patients shifted under their sheets, stirring and blinking at the pale light. Nurses moved briskly, checking vitals and adjusting blankets, voices calm and confident where before they had been hesitant and tense. The very floorboards seemed lighter beneath Hale's boots, as though the building itself was exhaling after a long and perilous night. He paused at the bed of young Thomas Hale, who had survived his near-fatal exposure to the chemically laced syrups of an overconfident surgeon. The boy's chest rose evenly now, a steady rhythm marking the return of natural breath. His eyes, wide and alert, reflected the first glimmers of clarity since his ordeal. Hale knelt beside him, brushing back damp curls. "How are you feeling, Thomas?" he asked gently. The boy's small lips curved in a tentative smile. "Better, sir," he whispered, voice still weak, but imbued with a vitality absent in previous days. I can breathe properly." Hale's heart, which had been heavy with weeks of tension, lifted fractionally. It was not a complete relief. He knew the recovery would be long, fragile, but it was a beginning. The ward without vapors was a sanctuary again, not merely a place of suspended unconsciousness. He moved along the corridor, inspecting each bed. Patients who had been barely conscious, their minds blurred by chemicals, now exhibited small signs of awareness, fingers grasping blankets, eyes following the motions of the nurses, murmured words that were coherent, if weak. The relief in the air was palpable. Nurses exhaled quietly, their expressions softening. They moved with purpose rather than fear, understanding that each patient they tended was fully present, fully alive, and not merely drifting within a chemically induced haze. Hale's eyes fell upon the empty vials on the tray beside the central bed. Ether, chloroform, and morphine, once administered with reckless abandon, had been removed, catalogued, and secured under the new regulations enforced by the Apothecary Act. The city had acted. For the first time, oversight, accountability, and law intersected with medicine to protect life rather than manipulate it. A gentle breeze lifted the corners of the curtains, and Hale allowed himself a long, measured breath. He had spent weeks observing, documenting, and intervening. He had witnessed the dangers of unregulated chemicals, the stillness of children, the silence of widows, the coma-like stupor of patients under supposed care. He had seen grief, fear, and near tragedy. And now, for the first time, the ward was free. Outside, London hummed, as it always did. The fog had lifted slightly, exposing streets and faces that had once been obscured by chemical dreams. The city, unaware of the meticulous work carried out within its hospital walls, continued its daily rhythm. Yet inside the ward without vapors, life returned in quiet increments. A cough, a murmur, a blink, a stretch. Hale leaned against the doorway for a long moment, eyes sweeping the corridor. Nurses, patients, and attendants all moved in a rhythm that was natural, human, and tangible. The ward had exhaled its chemical fog, but the lessons remained: vigilance, care, and humility. Medicine, powerful as it was, demanded respect, restraint, and awareness of its consequences. For the first time in weeks, Hale allowed himself to feel hope. The ward without vapors had become more than a physical space. It had become a testament to life reclaimed, to awareness restored, and to a city's ability, if only cautiously and slowly, to confront its dependence on chemical control. And in that restored ward, the quiet breath of the patients rose in gentle cadence, a fragile, beautiful chorus of survival. London's fog pressed against the city that morning with the tenacity of a tide refusing to recede. It clung to the streets and alleys, wound around lampposts, and pooled beneath windows, as though the very air had become a living, patient observer of the city's secrets. But today, for the first time in months, the fog met resistance. It brushed against the streets and gas lamps and faded slightly, beaten back by the awareness, the vigilance, and the courage of those who had refused to remain silent. Dr. Jonathan Hale walked briskly along Belgrave Passage, boots striking the wet cobblestones with deliberate rhythm. He paused at familiar corners, noting the faint glimmer of sunlight piercing the thinning fog. London had begun to breathe differently, slightly sharper, slightly freer, slightly more conscious of the choices that had once bound it beneath a veil of chemical sedation and unexamined trust. The streets were not yet fully clear. Chimneys still curled smoke into the grey morning air. The river shimmered beneath the mist. The cries of vendors and the clatter of carriages echoed softly through the alleys. Yet the oppressive weight of unregulated anaesthetics, tonics, and stimulants, the invisible hand that had subdued children, widows, and patients alike, had been checked. Hospitals enforced the Apothecary Act. Chemists' records were scrutinized. Families were informed. Surgeons and physicians faced accountability, and those who had been silenced by the promise of calm had begun to stir. Hale paused outside a small tenement window, observing young Thomas Hale playing in the courtyard below, his laughter ringing clearly through the crisp air. The boy's survival had been uncertain, a near miss that had shaken even the most confident of physicians. Watching him now, Hale felt a warmth he had not allowed himself in weeks, a cautious, tentative relief. The child's life had been preserved, his lungs and mind freed from chemical oppression, and in that small triumph lay a broader hope for the city. In the Bramcote townhouse, Margaret Bramcote stood at her window, gazing at the streets below. Her mourning dress still clung tightly to her form, but her eyes were steady, reflecting the faint gold of the morning sun. She had demanded the truth, insisted on accountability, and inspired action that reached the highest offices of the city. The fog that had shrouded the deaths, the near misses, and the silent suffering of so many could no longer hide behind polite euphemisms and the prestige of white coats. Margaret's resolve had illuminated what the chemicals could not. Across the city, apothecaries counted their inventory, removing vials that had once flowed unchecked into homes and hospitals. Surgeons carefully documented dosages, mindful of the law and the moral weight now pressed upon them. Nurses, once burdened by fear and complicit silence, moved with steady confidence, their steps guided by vigilance rather than apprehension. London itself seemed to inhale, aware for the first time of the substances that had permeated its streets, its wards, and its homes. Hale lifted his gaze toward the rooftops, where the fog had thinned to a faint veil, wisps curling like retreating spirits. He allowed himself a long exhalation, tasting the crisp air, aware that this clarity was hard-won, fragile, and remarkable. The city had been lulled for months by the promise of painless relief, chemical comfort, and social convenience. Lives had been imperiled in the quiet, and yet, through courage, vigilance, and the persistence of conscience, London had emerged into light. The fog had lifted, finally, though not entirely. Shadows remained, traces of past mistakes, reminders of the delicate balance between innovation and recklessness, progress and care. But for the first time, the city could see clearly. Its citizens could breathe freely. Its hospitals could function with conscience. Its families could trust, cautiously, in the protection of law and oversight. And in that new clarity, as the first rays of sun painted the Thames in gold and grey, Dr. Jonathan Hale and Margaret Bramcote, along with countless unnamed witnesses and guardians of life, understood that the fight had been worth it. The fog had lifted, and though London's vigilance must continue, the city had learned to stand awake, no longer ensnared by the invisible chains of chemical comfort. The streets gleamed, the lamps flickered, the air carried possibility, and for the first time in many months, London exhaled.